There is a machine in Arc Raiders that has ended more runs, destroyed more gear, and caused more controller throwing moments than almost anything else in the game. And today we are going to spend the next 8 hours talking about exactly what it is, where it came from, and why it might be far more important to the Arc invasion than most players ever stop to realize. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I want to take a moment to explain why I made this video and what choices I made when putting it together. The Rocketeer is one of those enemies that players complain about constantly, but rarely sit down to actually think about in any serious depth. It shows up, it ruins your day, you die, you respawn, and the cycle repeats. But when I started digging into the available lore, the environmental storytelling, the machine's behavior patterns, and the way it fits into the broader Arc machine hierarchy, I realized there was a genuinely interesting story buried underneath all the frustration. I made this video because I wanted to pull that story out and lay it flat on the table for people to look at properly. One specific choice I made when assembling this was to lead with the machine's function before its form. Most lore videos about enemies start with the visual design, and I deliberately flipped that. I wanted you to understand what the Rocketeer does, and why it does it before we ever talked about what it looks like, or how it was built. I think that reordering makes the whole picture land harder. With that said, let us get into it. Chapter 1. The sky belongs to Arc. The first thing any new raider learns when they drop into the world of Arc Raiders is that the ground is dangerous. There are machines everywhere. They patrol, they scan, they respond, they escalate. The ground-level threat environment is dense and punishing, and it demands constant attention from anyone trying to survive long enough to extract with something worth keeping. Most new players spend their early hours entirely focused on what is in front of them and below them, because that is where the immediate threat lives, and that is where most of the fighting happens. It takes time before players start looking up. Looking up is when things change. The sky in Arc Raiders is not neutral space, it is not a backdrop or an aesthetic choice. The sky is a controlled domain, and the entity controlling it is Arc. This is something the game communicates subtly at first, and then with increasing directness as players spend more time in the world. The aerial presence of Arc machines is not random or incidental. It is deliberate, it is strategic, and the Rocketeer is one of the clearest expressions of that strategy in the entire game. To understand the Rocketeer properly, you first need to understand the broader context of what Arc is actually trying to accomplish. Arc is not simply an invading force in the traditional military sense. It is not trying to occupy territory the way a human army would. It does not need supply lines, command structures, or population centers. Arc operates on a different logic entirely, one that suggests it is either harvesting something from the earth or eliminating something from it, and possibly both simultaneously. The machines that Arc deploys are not soldiers in any recognizable sense. They are instruments of a process, and that process is still only partially understood by the raiders who fight against it. Within that context, aerial assets like the Rocketeer serve a function that goes beyond simple combat patrol. When you place a powerful, mobile, hard-to-destroy aerial unit over a specific location, you are doing something very specific. You are declaring ownership. You are saying, with considerable force, that this space belongs to Arc, and that anything that enters it does so at extreme risk. The Rocketeer is a declaration as much as it is a weapon. An understanding that changes how you think about every encounter you have ever had with one. The earliest accounts from raiders who survived encounters with the Rocketeer describe a consistent pattern of behavior that is worth paying close attention to. The machine does not rush in immediately. It orbits. It watches. It lets its presence be known before it commits to a direct engagement. This is not the behavior of a system designed purely for destruction. A purely destructive system would engage the moment it detected a target. The Rocketeer instead seems to follow a protocol that involves establishing dominance of the airspace before moving into a direct fire posture, and that distinction matters more than it might initially seem. One way to read this behavior is that the Rocketeer is designed to psychologically as well as physically control an area. By announcing itself and then waiting, it forces raiders into a reactive state. It forces them to make decisions under pressure, rather than on their own terms. Any experienced raider will tell you that the moment you hear the Rocketeer's engines or see its silhouette in the distance, your entire plan for that run shifts immediately. You are no longer executing your strategy. You are responding to the Rocketeer's strategy, and that is exactly where ARC wants you to be. The designation Rocketeer is one that players have adopted as a shorthand, and it points toward the most immediately obvious and devastating aspect of this machine, which is its missile armament. The guided missile barrages that the Rocketeer deploys are not just powerful in terms of raw damage, they are psychologically overwhelming in their tracking behavior. A missile that follows you is a fundamentally different kind of threat than a bullet traveling in a straight line. It removes the option of simply moving out of the way. It demands a more complex response, and it does so while you are already under pressure in a combat scenario where complexity is your enemy. The guided nature of the Rocketeer's missiles is one of the most important design choices in the entire machine's arsenal, and it points towards something interesting about how ARC approaches the problem of dealing with raiders specifically. Raiders are mobile. They use cover aggressively. They are trained, at least in the sense that surviving raiders have learned to be unpredictable. A system designed to counter mobile, cover-using, unpredictable targets would naturally gravitate toward guided munitions rather than direct-fire weapons. And the Rocketeer's loadout reflects exactly that kind of thinking. This suggests, and it is worth pausing on the word suggests here because we are working with interpretation rather than hard canon, that ARC's machines are not using generic weapon systems. They are using weapon systems that have been optimized specifically for the kinds of targets they are likely to encounter. The Rocketeer is not a machine that was designed to fight other machines or to destroy static installations. Its weapons are built for hunting living things in complex terrain, and that specificity tells us something about how ARC thinks about the human problem. The terrain that raiders operate in is enormously varied. There are open areas, dense urban ruins, collapsed industrial structures, narrow corridors, and wide plazas, all within relatively short distances of each other. A machine that operates at altitude with guided missiles is one of the few weapon systems that can engage targets effectively across all of those terrain types simultaneously. Ground-based machines are limited by line of sight and physical obstacles. The Rocketeer transcends those limitations by simply rising above them. And that aerial positioning is not just a tactical advantage in the moment, but a strategic advantage in terms of area control. Consider what it means for a raider's movement options when a Rocketeer is active in an area. Suddenly, any open space becomes dangerous. Moving from cover to cover requires timing. Rooftops, which might otherwise offer a superior vantage point for a raider, become kill zones. The verticality that raiders might otherwise exploit to gain positional advantage is effectively denied by a machine that operates at a higher altitude than any raider can comfortably reach. The Rocketeer reshapes the battlefield the moment it appears, and it does so without firing a single missile. The armoring on the Rocketeer is another aspect of its design that deserves serious attention. Players who have tried to engage the Rocketeer directly with small arms know the frustration of watching rounds deflect or fail to penetrate. The machine is built to absorb punishment while remaining airborne and operational. This is not an accident of design. A lightly armored aerial unit would be vulnerable to suppressive fire that could force it to withdraw or reduce its effectiveness. The Rocketeer's heavy armor ensures that engaging it directly is itself a dangerous proposition, because the time spent firing at it is time spent exposed in the open. This creates a tactical dilemma that ARC seems to have engineered deliberately. You can ignore the Rocketeer and try to operate in its presence, which is extremely risky given its missile capacity. You can attempt to engage it directly, which requires sustained fire from exposed positions, or you can withdraw entirely, which is exactly what ARC wants you to do. The Rocketeer offers no clean options. Every response to its presence is a compromise, and the least bad option in most cases is retreating from the area entirely, which means surrendering whatever objective brought you there in the first place. The locations where the Rocketeer is typically deployed provide another layer of information about its purpose. Raiders consistently report Rocketeer activity near high-value locations, areas that contain resources, technology, information, or infrastructure that would be meaningful to anyone trying to understand or resist ARC. This is not the kind of deployment pattern you would expect from a random patrol system. It is the kind of pattern you would expect from a system specifically designed to protect things of value from being accessed or removed. This deployment logic points toward a larger organizational structure within ARC's forces. Somebody or something is making decisions about where the Rocketeer is positioned. Something is determining which locations are worth the resource investment of deploying a heavy aerial unit. And the consistent placement near high-value sites suggests that ARC has a very clear sense of what is valuable and what is not, which in turn suggests a level of situational awareness and strategic planning that is genuinely unsettling when you think about it carefully. The question of what exactly ARC is protecting in these high-value locations is one of the most interesting threads in the entire game's lore. Raiders who managed to successfully access these locations under Rocketeer coverage described finding things like advanced ARC hardware, anomalous energy signatures, pre-invasion infrastructure that has been repurposed or modified, and occasionally evidence of activities that suggest ARC is engaged in some kind of long-term project at these sites. The Rocketeer's presence is not just protection. It is a signal that something important is happening in that location, and that ARC is committed to ensuring it continues undisturbed. One particularly interesting aspect of the Rocketeer's behavior in these high-value areas is its interaction with other ARC machines. The Rocketeer does not operate as an isolated unit. It functions as part of an integrated response system, and when a raider manages to attract its attention, the broader ARC security apparatus in the area typically escalates in response. This coordination between aerial and ground-based units suggests a communication or coordination protocol that links ARC machines together in ways that go beyond simple shared sensor networks. The implications of that coordination are significant. If ARC machines are sharing tactical information in real time, if the Rocketeer's identification of a target is immediately communicated to ground units that then adjust their patrol routes and response postures accordingly, then ARC is not a collection of individually programmed machines, but something closer to a distributed tactical intelligence. The Rocketeer becomes, in this reading, not just a weapon, but a node in a network. And destroying it, or evading it, does not simply remove a threat, but triggers a response across the entire local network. Raider teams that have attempted systematic operations in areas with Rocketeer coverage report that the experience is fundamentally different from operating in areas patrolled only by ground units. The aerial dimension adds a pressure that cannot be addressed through conventional cover-based tactics. It requires thinking in 3 dimensions, timing movements to orbital patterns, using obscurance, terrain masking through large structures, and in some cases simply accepting a level of exposure that would be suicidal against ground forces, but is manageable given the Rocketeer's engagement distances and missile flight times. The development of anti-Rocketeer tactics among experienced raiders represents one of the more interesting emergent gameplay narratives in ARC Raiders, one that the lore quietly acknowledges in the form of fragments, environmental storytelling, and the occasional piece of text that suggests raiders have been studying these machines for some time. The knowledge of how to survive in Rocketeer-contested airspace is hard-won and carefully guarded, passed between raiders who have survived encounters that others did not. This creates a kind of informal expertise economy around the Rocketeer specifically. What makes the Rocketeer particularly frustrating, and this is something nearly every player will recognize immediately, is the way its guided missiles combine with its aerial mobility to eliminate most traditional escape strategies. On the ground, you can break line of sight with a machine by ducking behind a wall. You can use distance to your advantage if you are fast enough. You can use the terrain itself as a weapon by forcing ground-based machines into choke points. None of these strategies fully neutralize the Rocketeer because it can reposition faster than most raiders can move, and because its missiles do not care about intermediate terrain in the way a direct-fire weapon would. The flight characteristics of the Rocketeer are worth examining in some detail, because they reveal interesting things about its design priorities. The machine is not built for speed. It is not trying to chase raiders across the map at high velocity. Its movement pattern is more deliberate, more measured. It establishes a patrol orbit that it maintains with considerable consistency until a target is acquired, and then it transitions from patrol mode to engagement mode with a shift in its flight characteristics that experienced raiders have learned to recognize as a warning sign That transition from patrol to engagement is one of the most important moments in any Rocketeer encounter. There is a brief window between the machine identifying a target and the first missile being launched, during which a raider with good situational awareness can take decisive action, either by breaking line of sight immediately, initiating a defensive movement, to terrain masking, or in rare cases where the equipment is available, beginning a counter-engagement. Missing that window is what leads to the characteristic experience of being caught in the open while guided missiles close in from multiple directions. The Rocketeer's status as an aerial unit means it occupies a unique tactical niche among ARC's machines, one that ground forces simply cannot fill regardless of how numerous or well-armed they are. The sky is a dimension of the battlefield that most of ARC's forces ignore entirely. Not because ARC lacks aerial capability, but because most ARC machines are optimized for ground-level operations. The Rocketeer is the exception to this, and its exceptionalism makes it special in a way that extends beyond its individual combat effectiveness. When you encounter a Rocketeer, you are encountering something that ARC deployed intentionally in that specific location for a specific purpose. You are not running into a general-purpose patrol unit. You are running into a specialized, high-value asset that ARC has committed to the defense of a specific site. That context should shift how you think about the encounter from a pure combat scenario to something closer to an intelligence indicator. The Rocketeer is not just an obstacle, it is information. The armor configuration of the Rocketeer reflects a design philosophy that prioritizes sustained operational capability over raw agility. Unlike some other ARC machines that sacrifice protection for speed or maneuverability, the Rocketeer is built to stay on station for extended periods while absorbing fire from raiders who attempt to engage it. This is consistent with its role as a persistent area denial platform rather than a rapid response unit, and it means that encounters with the Rocketeer tend to be prolonged affairs rather than quick exchanges. Prolonged encounters with the Rocketeer are particularly punishing because the machine's missile capacity appears effectively unlimited within any single engagement. Or at least the reload or resupply cycle is short enough that raiders have not observed it running dry under normal circumstances. This creates an asymmetry that favors ARC heavily. The Rocketeer can sustain its offensive pressure indefinitely, while raiders have finite ammunition, finite health, and finite time before the pressures of the extraction timer or other threats force a decision. Attrition in a Rocketeer encounter almost always favors ARC. The sound design around the Rocketeer is one of the game's most effective pieces of environmental storytelling. The engine note of the machine in patrol mode is distinct from its engagement mode, and experienced players learn to read those sounds the way a naturalist learns to distinguish bird calls. The shift in pitch or intensity that signals an active targeting solution is one of those sounds that raters describe as triggering an immediate physical response long before conscious thought catches up. It is the sound of danger that bypasses analysis and goes straight to action. This kind of acoustic warning system is not accidental. The Rocketeer is loud by design in a way that most ARC machines are not. Many ground-based ARC units benefit from a degree of quietness that makes them harder to detect at range. The Rocketeer makes itself known. This might seem counterintuitive for a hunting machine, but it makes more sense when you consider the area denial function. You do not need to hide if your goal is not to ambush, but to occupy. The Rocketeer's noise is itself a deterrent, a broadcast to anyone in range that this area is contested airspace. The visible design of the Rocketeer communicates a great deal about ARC's aesthetic and engineering sensibilities. The machine has a silhouette that is instantly recognizable, even at significant distance, a deliberate choice that seems intended to make it identifiable before it is within engagement range. This long-range recognizability serves the deterrence function, ensuring that raiders who spot it at a distance have the option to reroute before they are close enough to trigger its engagement protocols. ARC, in this reading, is offering an out rather than simply hunting everything in range. That offer of an out is interesting from a lore perspective because it is consistent with the behavior of some other ARC machines. There is a pattern across multiple ARC unit types that suggests their primary objective is not the destruction of raiders per se, but the protection of specific activities or locations. Raiders who stay out of those locations are often not pursued. The aggression is territorial rather than exterminatory, at least in the short term, and the Rocketeer's visible and audible deterrence fits that pattern. The question of whether this deterrence behavior reflects an underlying programming constraint, a strategic calculation, or something more philosophically complex is one of the genuinely interesting open questions in Arc Raiders lore. A machine designed purely to eliminate threats would not advertise itself. The fact that the Rocketeer does suggests that either its designers wanted to give targets a chance to withdraw, or that there is some calculation being made about the cost and benefit of actual engagement versus threat display. Either interpretation opens up interesting possibilities about how Arc thinks about the raiders it encounters. Raiders who have made detailed observations of Rocketeer patrol routes describe patterns that change over time in ways that suggest either active reprogramming or adaptive learning. The orbital paths that a Rocketeer follows around a high-value location do not remain exactly constant across multiple visits to the same site. Small variations accumulate over time into meaningful pattern shifts that can wrong-foot raiders who relied on previous route observations. This adaptability is one of the Rocketeer's most dangerous characteristics because it means that information about its patrol patterns degrades in value the older it gets. Adaptive patrol patterns in a machine designed for area denial suggest something beyond simple scripted behavior. If the Rocketeer's routes are truly varying based on accumulated experience or external reprogramming, then it represents a category of machine that Arc has invested significant sophistication in. Not every machine needs to be adaptive. Ground-level patrol units can operate effectively with fixed routes, but an aerial platform defending genuinely high-value assets benefits enormously from unpredictability, and the Rocketeer seems to have been given exactly that capability. The relationship between the Rocketeer and the concept of high-value locations deserves more than passing mention because the game's definition of high value is not always obvious from a raider's perspective. A location might be valuable to Arc for reasons that are not immediately clear to a raider looking at it with human eyes. What looks like a collapsed building might contain Arc infrastructure that is actively operational below the visible surface. What looks like an empty plaza might be positioned directly above something that Arc is processing or extracting. The Rocketeer's presence overhead is sometimes the first clue that a location matters more than it appears to. Some of the most important lore discoveries in Arc Raiders have come from raiders who died following the Rocketeer's presence to its source, rather than avoiding it. By tracking where the Rocketeer spends the most time, what it circles most tightly, and where it becomes most aggressive, players have been able to identify locations that hold genuine lore significance. The Rocketeer, in this sense, functions as an inadvertent lore indicator, a bright arrow pointing at exactly the things Arc most wants you not to find. The contrast between the Rocketeer's role as a deterrent and its role as an indicator is one of the great ironies of its design from a raider's perspective. Arc deploys it to keep people away, but its very presence tells people that something worth finding is nearby. A location with no security would attract less interest than a location with a Rocketeer orbiting above it. The investment in protection creates the signal that attracts attention, and one can only wonder whether this irony is noted in whatever passes for strategic planning within Arc's operational structure. The number of Rocketeer units that have been observed in any given deployment zone at a single time is generally limited. This scarcity suggests that the Rocketeer is a premium asset within Arc's force structure, not something that can be deployed liberally across every contested area. This scarcity makes its deployment decisions even more informative. When Arc commits a Rocketeer to a location, it is making a significant resource investment, and that investment reflects the value Arc places on whatever is being protected. The recovery of downed Rocketeer units is something that raiders have attempted with varying degrees of success. The hardware recovered from Rocketeer wreckage is reportedly among the most advanced Arc technology that can be obtained outside of direct Arc installation access. The materials used in its construction, the processor components that can be recovered from its guidance systems, and the propulsion hardware are all items of significant interest to anyone trying to understand how Arc machines work at a fundamental level. This makes the Rocketeer a target not just when it is blocking objectives, but in its own right as a source of reverse engineering material. The risk-reward calculation of actually hunting a Rocketeer rather than avoiding it is one of the most complex in Arc Raiders, and it divides the player community in interesting ways. Conservative raiders who prioritize extraction rates and long-term gear accumulation tend to avoid Rocketeer engagement unless forced into it. Aggressive raiders who are chasing high-tier components and lore items are sometimes willing to accept the enormous risk of a direct engagement for the potential reward. Both approaches are defensible, and the existence of both reflects the richness of the decision space the Rocketeer creates. The lore of Arc Raiders is assembled from fragments, and the fragments available about the Rocketeer specifically are fewer and more ambiguous than those available for some other machine types. This scarcity of direct information forces a more inferential approach to understanding it, and that inference-based analysis is actually one of the things that makes the Rocketeer so interesting to examine in depth. We are building a picture from partial information, which is exactly the situation that raiders in the game's fiction are in. And that parallel between the player's experience and the character's experience is one of the more elegant things about how Arc Raiders handles its lore delivery. The Rocketeer's particular kind of danger is worth articulating precisely because it differs from the danger posed by other Arc machines in ways that matter for how you respond to it. Most Arc ground units are dangerous because they are effective at close to medium range and because they can be present in large numbers. The Rocketeer is dangerous because it operates at a range and altitude that removes most conventional counter options, because its guided missiles make movement itself dangerous, and because its heavy armor makes direct engagement a poor choice in almost all circumstances. These are different problems requiring different solutions. Early raiders encountering the Rocketeer for the first time often make the mistake of treating it like a more dangerous version of a ground unit, applying the same cover-based tactics they use against other machine types. This approach fails consistently because the aerial dimension breaks the fundamental assumption of cover-based tactics, which is that cover provides safety by blocking line of sight. From altitude, the Rocketeer can often see over, around, or between cover elements that would fully screen a raider from ground-based observation. The geometry of engagement changes completely once altitude is added to the equation. This geometric problem, the way that altitude collapses the effectiveness of ground-level cover, is something that experienced raiders understand intuitively, but new players have to learn through painful trial and error. It is also something that Arc appears to have understood when designing the Rocketeer's mission profile. A machine that operates from altitude specifically exploits the limitations of the defensive posture that ground-based raiders naturally adopt. The Rocketeer is an answer to a specific tactical problem, and the problem it is answering is exactly the defensive style that keeps raiders alive against everything else Arc deploys. The drone-like flight behavior of the Rocketeer, the way it maintains a relatively consistent altitude and orbital pattern outside of active engagement, distinguishes it from the kind of aggressively dynamic aerial combat that players might expect from a flying machine. It is not trying to match your movements precisely or pursue you through complex three-dimensional space in the way that a sci-fi dogfighting drone might. It is instead doing something more practical and, in many ways, more dangerous, which is maintaining a dominant position that gives it firing angles on the area below, while conserving whatever propulsion energy or resources it needs for sustained operation. The sustained operation aspect is significant. The Rocketeer is not a strike asset that appears, fires, and withdraws. It is a persistent presence. It stays on station. This endurance characteristic means that waiting it out is generally not a viable strategy unless a raider has an extremely well-concealed position and is willing to spend enormous amounts of time doing nothing, which, in a game with extraction timers and competitive resource dynamics, is usually not a practical option. The Rocketeer knows, if we can use that word loosely, that time is on its side. The way that Arc machines communicate with each other, including the Rocketeer, remains one of the bigger mysteries in Arc Raiders lore and one of the areas where player research has been most active. The existence of some kind of machine coordination is undeniable from observation. The question is what the channel looks like, whether it is direct wireless communication, some form of broadcast that raiders have not been able to detect or jam, or something more exotic tied to Arc's broader presence in the world. The Rocketeer's coordination behavior, its apparent ability to trigger broader security responses through its engagement decisions, puts it at an interesting position in whatever that communication network looks like. The story of the Rocketeer is, at its most basic level, a story about control. ARC has established control of the sky over certain areas, and the Rocketeer is the instrument of that control. Everything about it, its weapons, its armor, its patrol behavior, its coordination with ground forces, its deployment near high-value sites, all of it points toward a single coherent strategic objective: deny access, make the cost of approach prohibitive, and do so in a way that is persistent, adaptable, and difficult to counter through any single tactical approach. That is the Rocketeer, and as a piece of strategic design, it is remarkable. In the chapters that follow, we are going to go much deeper into each of these aspects. We are going to look at the Rocketeer's construction and what we can infer about how and why it was built the way it was. We are going to look at its weapon systems in detail and examine what those systems tell us about ARC's threat assessment of raiders specifically. We are going to look at the locations it guards and try to build a picture of what ARC is actually doing in those places. And we are going to look at what raider survivors of Rocketeer encounters have reported about the machine's behavior and what those reports suggest about its underlying programming or intelligence. By the end of this, you will understand the Rocketeer in a way that changes how you look at it every time it appears in your run. Chapter 2: Built to Rule the Sky. Understanding the Rocketeer's construction. The construction of ARC machines generally reflects a design philosophy that prioritizes function with an efficiency that is almost inhuman in its disregard for anything beyond operational effectiveness. Ground units are built to navigate terrain, identify targets, engage and resist engagement, and coordinate with other units. Their forms follow these functions with a directness that has no aesthetic consideration in it. The Rocketeer follows this same philosophy, but applies it to an entirely different operational domain. And the result is a machine that is visually distinctive precisely because its demands are so different from anything operating at ground level. Aerial operation places constraints on design that ground operation does not. Weight is a critical variable. Every component that goes into a flying machine must justify its mass against the power budget of the propulsion system. The Rocketeer's designers, or the ARC intelligence that produced its design specifications, made choices about what to include and what to exclude that reveal priorities in a way that a ground unit's design does not. When you see what the Rocketeer carries and how it is armored, you are seeing a series of trade-offs that were made deliberately, and those trade-offs tell a story. The propulsion system of the Rocketeer is one of its most discussed aspects among players who pay attention to mechanical detail. The machine manages to sustain flight while carrying substantial armor and a significant missile payload, which implies a propulsion technology that is considerably more energy-dense than anything in the pre-invasion human technological base. ARC's propulsion technology is one of the areas where the gap between human and ARC capability is most visible, and the Rocketeer makes that gap impossible to ignore every time you see it hovering in place with what appears to be relatively minimal effort. The sustained hover capability is particularly interesting. Fixed-wing aircraft achieve efficiency through forward motion, generating lift through wing geometry rather than direct thrust. A hovering machine does not have that option. It must generate lift entirely through thrust, which is energy expensive in conventional terms. The Rocketeer's ability to maintain a hover for extended periods while carrying its combat payload suggests either an extraordinarily efficient power source or a propulsion mechanism that does not work on the same principles as human. Rotorcraft. Either possibility is significant from a lore perspective. The armor on the Rocketeer is not uniform. Players who have engaged it seriously report that different zones of the machine respond differently to incoming fire. Some areas appear to have heavier armoring, while others, typically associated with propulsion or sensor systems, show more vulnerability. This non-uniform armor distribution is consistent with a design philosophy that concentrates protection where it matters most, while accepting calculated vulnerability in areas where full protection would create unacceptable weight. Penalties. It is a sophisticated engineering approach, and one that suggests the Rocketeer's designers had a detailed threat model to work from. The threat model that informed the Rocketeer's armor design points toward a specific picture of what ARC expects to be shooting at it. The most protected zones would presumably be those most likely to be targeted by the most common and most effective anti-air approaches that raiders use. If the most heavily armored zones are on the underside of the machine, that suggests ARC expected most incoming fire to come from below. If heavier armor is concentrated around critical propulsion components, that suggests raiders have historically been effective at forcing aircraft down by targeting their propulsion. The armor layout is, in this sense, a history of past engagements, translated into metal. The sensor package on the Rocketeer appears to be significantly more sophisticated than what is present on typical ARC ground units. This makes sense given the operational demands of aerial observation. A ground unit that operates at ground level has a sensor horizon limited by terrain. The Rocketeer, operating from altitude, has a much larger potential detection envelope and presumably needs sensors capable of taking advantage of that larger field of view. Observations of the Rocketeer's detection behavior support this, with the machine appearing to identify targets at longer ranges than most ground units under comparable conditions. The guidance systems for the Rocketeer's missiles represent another area of significant technological sophistication. Guided munitions require continuous target tracking, missile attitude control, and flight path computation, all happening simultaneously and at a pace that demands processing capability that many human systems of the pre-invasion era would have found challenging. ARC has apparently found it straightforward, and the tracking behavior of Rocketeer missiles, their ability to follow targets through evasive maneuvers with a consistency that players find infuriating, speaks to a guidance system that has significant computational resources behind it. The missile bodies themselves, when examined in recovered wreckage, reveal construction techniques and material choices that are distinctly ARC in character. The propellant burns hotter than any conventional explosive. The Warhead materials are alloys that do not correspond to anything in the pre-invasion industrial base, and the guidance hardware uses component architectures that human engineers examining them have found deeply unfamiliar. This alien engineering is not just a curiosity. It tells us that the Rocketeer was not reverse engineered from human technology or built using human manufacturing methods. It was produced by ARC for ARC-to-ARC specifications. The implications of fully ARC origin construction are significant for the lore. It means that the Rocketeer predates any contact between ARC and human engineers. It could not have been developed in response to observed human tactical behavior in any adaptive manufacturing sense. Its design was fixed before ARC arrived, or at least before ARC had meaningful interaction with human defenders. This suggests that ARC arrived with a predetermined force structure that included aerial elements, like the Rocketeer, already developed and ready for deployment, which in turn suggests that ARC's invasion was planned with the expectation of needing aerial superiority platforms from the beginning. A pre-planned force structure, including aerial denial assets, suggests that ARC had advanced knowledge of what it would be facing. The Rocketeer's specific effectiveness against the kind of tactical behavior that raiders use is too well matched to be accidental if the machine arrived already built and fully specified. ARC either studied human tactical behavior before the invasion began, derived it from first principles using some kind of predictive modeling, or the Rocketeer happens to be effective against human behavior because the behaviors it counters are universal rather than specifically human. Each of these possibilities has different implications for what ARC is and how it operates. The maintenance requirements of the Rocketeer are something that players rarely think about, but that have interesting lore implications. In any military force, aerial assets are typically more maintenance-intensive than ground assets. The complexity of flight systems, the stress of repeated aerial operations, the need for periodic propulsion system servicing. All of these create logistical demands that have historically made air power expensive to sustain. If ARC's Rocketeer units require maintenance, something must be providing it, which means ARC has some kind of logistics infrastructure capable of sustaining its aerial assets in the field. The existence of ARC logistics infrastructure is something the game hints at but does not spell out clearly. There are locations in the game world that appear to serve supply or support functions within ARC's operation, and some of them correspond to areas where Rocketeer activity is particularly concentrated. One possible reading of this is that the Rocketeer operates in proximity to its support infrastructure, staying near the facilities that keep it operational. Another reading is that the Rocketeer is assigned to protect those facilities as among the most valuable elements of ARC's presence in the area. The relationship between the Rocketeer and ARC's logistics network is worth exploring more deeply than most players do. The weight optimization that clearly went into the Rocketeer's design is most visible in what it does not carry. Despite being a heavily armoured and well-armed machine, it does not appear to carry any close-quarters engagement systems. Its weapons are all medium to long range, designed for engagement at distances where altitude provides an advantage. This absence of short-range systems is a deliberate design choice that accepts vulnerability to close approach in exchange for optimized performance at the ranges where it operates most effectively. In practical terms, it means that a raider who manages to get very close to the Rocketeer has a different experience than one who is caught in the open at range. The visual appearance of the Rocketeer, beyond its functional design elements, carries a certain quality that players often describe as oppressive. There is something in its silhouette that communicates danger and authority in a way that goes beyond the simple recognition of threat cues. This might be an emergent property of its design, simply the natural result of a large, armed flying machine looking frightening. Or it might be a deliberate design choice by whatever entity within ARC specified the machine's visual parameters. ARC's aesthetics across its various machine types show consistency that suggests design intentionality rather than purely functional derivation. The size of the Rocketeer relative to other ARC machines puts it in an interesting category. It is large enough to be immediately visible at significant range, reinforcing its deterrence value. But it is not so large that it becomes cumbersome or difficult to maneuver in the environments where it operates. This sizing suggests a deliberate optimization for the specific environments it was intended to patrol. Urban and semi-urban ruins with significant vertical structure that an oversized machine would struggle to navigate. ARC apparently thought carefully about the operational environment when specifying the Rocketeer's dimensions. The coloring and surface texture of the Rocketeer are consistent with other ARC machines, which have a characteristic visual identity that is distinctly different from anything human manufactured. The surfaces are not painted in any conventional sense. The material itself has properties that distinguish it visually, giving it a quality that players frequently describe using words like alien or wrong in a way that is difficult to articulate precisely, but immediately felt upon observation. This visual distinctiveness serves the recognition function, ensuring that a Rocketeer is identifiable as an ARC machine immediately and specifically as a Rocketeer rather than any other machine type. The structural integrity of the Rocketeer under combat damage is something that has been extensively documented by raiders who have engaged them. The machine does not simply fail in the way that human aircraft do when taking critical hits. It degrades in stages, with different systems showing impairment at different damage thresholds before the machine reaches the point of total failure. This staged degradation is itself a design feature. It means that a Rocketeer that has taken significant damage is still a dangerous adversary, still capable of targeting and firing, even if its flight characteristics are compromised. Killing a damaged Rocketeer is not dramatically easier than killing an undamaged one until very specific damage thresholds are crossed. The staged degradation behavior is also informative from a design philosophy standpoint. A machine that continues to fight while damaged rather than withdrawing to repair or protect itself is one that has been programmed with a clear priority ordering. Mission continuation takes precedence over self-preservation. This is consistent with a design philosophy that values the objective, in this case area denial and protection of the guarded location, over the survival of the asset itself. The Rocketeer will fight until it cannot fight anymore, and this willingness to absorb damage while continuing to engage makes it significantly more dangerous than it would be if it had a self-preservation retreat threshold. The lack of an apparent retreat behavior is one of the things that distinguishes the Rocketeer from how many players expect a sophisticated machine to behave. Conventional wisdom about intelligent machines would suggest that a system sophisticated enough to track targets and coordinate with other units would also be sophisticated enough to recognize when tactical withdrawal preserves asset value. The Rocketeer apparently does not make that calculation, or if it does, the calculation consistently returns a value that says continue engaging rather than withdraw. Whether this is a programming constraint, a reflection of ARC's operational philosophy, or evidence that the Rocketeer simply lacks the processing complexity to make that kind of nuanced tactical decision is genuinely unclear. One interesting piece of evidence bearing on this question comes from edge cases documented by raiders who have deliberately driven damaged Rocketeers to specific damage states. There are reports of Rocketeer behavior changes at certain damage thresholds that could be interpreted as primitive self-preservation responses, changes in flight pattern, altitude adjustment, or shift in engagement posture that might represent something like a damage response protocol, even if not a full tactical withdrawal. These observations are anecdotal, and the sample sizes are small, but they point toward a possibility that the Rocketeer has more behavioral complexity than its apparent aggression suggests. The missile reload or resupply mechanism is one of the biggest outstanding mysteries about the Rocketeer's construction. Players who have sustained prolonged engagements with the machine report that it does not appear to run out of missiles on any reasonable timescale. Either the machine carries an enormous internal missile supply, or there is some kind of resupply mechanism that operates continuously, or the missiles are manufactured or assembled internally in some fashion that is unlike anything in the pre-invasion human technological base. Any of these possibilities is extraordinary, and the lack of observed missile depletion is one of the more unsettling aspects of the Rocketeer as an opponent. The guidance computers in Rocketeer missiles appear to operate independently once the missile is in flight, maintaining their tracking solution without continuous uplink to the parent machine. This is evident from observations of Rocketeer missile behavior when the machine itself is disabled mid-flight. Missiles already in the air continue to track their targets even after the Rocketeer that fired them is no longer operational. This autonomous missile guidance suggests that each individual missile contains sufficient computational hardware to run its own guidance algorithm, which is an enormous amount of miniaturized computing power packed into what is already a compact munition. The material science evident in Rocketeer construction is one of the areas most discussed in the research community that has developed around Arc Raider's lore. The alloys and composites used in its airframe are not simply more advanced versions of known materials. They exhibit properties that suggest fundamentally different approaches to materials development, operating on principles that human materials science had not reached and in some cases had not conceived of as a viable direction for research. Reverse engineering this hardware has proven enormously challenging, which is itself a piece of information about the technological gap between Arc and humanity. The energy systems aboard the Rocketeer are tightly integrated in a way that makes component isolation difficult. Power generation, propulsion, weapon systems, and sensors all appear to draw from the same energy infrastructure, which means that damage to any one system can cascade into effects on others. This tight integration is either a design weakness or an intentional choice to maximize energy efficiency at the cost of damage isolation. For a machine that does not prioritize self-preservation, the efficiency argument may have won out over the resilience argument in the design process. The question of where Arc manufactures or produces the Rocketeer is one that connects to much larger questions about Arc's presence on Earth and the nature of its operations. Ground-based Arc machines could theoretically be manufactured in facilities that have been established within Arc's occupied areas, but aerial units that are deployed into active raider operations require either on-site manufacture or transport from somewhere. The logistics of getting a Rocketeer from wherever it is made to wherever it is deployed is a story that the game has not told directly, and that the lore hints at only obliquely. Some lore fragments suggest the existence of Arc facilities that go deeper and are more permanent than the surface-level machine presence that raiders typically encounter. These facilities, if they exist, would be candidates for the manufacturing or staging points from which Rocketeers are deployed. The depth and permanence of such facilities would also explain why certain locations are defended with Rocketeer-level assets. If a Rocketeer is protecting the entrance or approaches to a manufacturing or staging facility, its deployment would make sense as something more than simple high-value area protection. It would be protecting Arc's ability to produce and deploy more machines. This recursive logic, the Rocketeer protecting facilities that produce more Rocketeers, is one of the darker implications of Arc's operations, and one that the available lore supports at least as a possibility worth taking seriously. If Arc's occupation is self-sustaining and self-replicating in this way, then the challenge facing raiders is not simply fighting what Arc currently has deployed, but fighting a system that can replenish and expand its assets over time. The Rocketeer's role in protecting that replication capacity would make it strategically indispensable rather than merely tactically annoying. The surface that the Rocketeer presents to incoming fire has been studied by raiders trying to find optimal engagement approaches. The arrangement of armor panels, the placement of seams and joints, and the geometry of the machine when viewed from below all create a problem-solving puzzle for anyone attempting to engage it directly. This puzzle is not accidental. The armor layout appears to have been designed with awareness of the most likely attack vectors, placing hardened surfaces facing the directions from which fire is most likely to come, and accepting more vulnerability in directions that are geometrically difficult for a ground-based raider to exploit. This attacker-aware armor design suggests that whoever, or whatever, specified the Rocketeer's construction had a detailed model of raider attack behavior and built countermeasures to it into the machine's fundamental structure. This level of anticipation of human tactical behavior is one of the more unsettling aspects of ARC's engineering. It is not enough that the machine is powerful. It has been specifically made difficult to fight by someone or something that understood how humans would try to fight it. The weight and size of individual Rocketeer missile components, as measured from recovered fragments, suggest manufacturing tolerances that exceed what pre-invasion human production was consistently capable of achieving. The components are machined to precisions that would have required the best industrial equipment humanity had, and they are produced in what appears to be volume. ARC's manufacturing precision suggests industrial infrastructure of enormous scale operating at standards that put human manufacturing to shame. And every Rocketeer missile encountered in the field is a data point supporting that picture. The integration of the Rocketeer into broader ARC operations is visible in its design choices in ways that only become clear when you know what to look for. Certain aspects of its communication hardware, certain choices about which systems are hardened and which are not, the particular configuration of its sensor package, these all point toward a machine designed to operate within a network rather than as a standalone unit. The Rocketeer is not complete in isolation. It is a component of a system, and understanding the system is necessary to fully understand the component. The flight ceiling of the Rocketeer under normal operational conditions is something that raiders have tested by attempting to engage it from the highest available positions within deployment areas. The machine maintains altitude that keeps it above the maximum useful range of most raider small arms, while still being close enough to the ground that its guided missiles can engage targets effectively. This altitude band, high enough to be safe from most ground fire, while low enough to engage effectively, is exactly the operational sweet spot that an aerial denial platform would want to occupy, and the Rocketeer appears to have been optimized to operate within it. The combination of all these construction elements, the propulsion system, the armor layout, the guided missile armament, the sensor package, the integrated energy systems, and the network communication hardware, creates a machine that is more than the sum of its parts. Each element is impressive in isolation, but together they create something that is precisely calibrated for a specific operational role. The Rocketeer is not a general-purpose combat machine that happens to fly. It is a specialized aerial area denial platform that was designed from the ground up or from the sky down for exactly the mission it performs. That specificity is a testament to the engineering sophistication of ARC, and it is one of the reasons the Rocketeer is as effective as it is. The ongoing efforts to reverse engineer Rocketeer components by raiders and the communities that support them are documented in various lore fragments as both a priority and a challenge. The priority is obvious. Understanding ARC's technology could provide enormous advantages to raider operations. The challenge is that ARC's engineering does not simply scale from human principles. Understanding a component's function does not automatically lead to understanding how to reproduce or counter it. The Rocketeer's construction represents a genuine frontier in terms of what humanity understands about technology, and every piece of recovered hardware is a data point in a research effort that has barely scratched the surface. Chapter 3: Weapons of Aerial Dominance, the Rocketeer's Arsenal. The primary weapon of the Rocketeer, as its designation implies, is its missile armament. But calling it simply a missile launcher understates the sophistication of what the machine actually deploys against its targets. The guided missiles that the Rocketeer fires are among the most technologically sophisticated munitions that raiders encounter in the game. And the mechanics of how they work, how they track, how they are defeated, and what they tell us about ARC's approach to aerial combat are worth examining in considerable depth. Guided munitions are not new to human warfare. Humanity developed various forms of guided missiles long before ARC arrived, and the general principle of a weapon that adjusts its flight path in response to target movement is well established in pre-invasion military thinking. What makes Rocketeer missiles different is not the concept but the execution, specifically the degree of accuracy, the response time to target maneuvers, and the apparent range over which the guidance system remains effective. These parameters exceed anything that human-guided munition technology had achieved by a considerable margin. The tracking behavior of Rocketeer missiles follows target movement with a consistency that suggests the guidance system is not simply following the last known position or using a predictive algorithm that extrapolates from velocity vectors. It appears to be making continuous real-time corrections that account for target behavior in ways that predictive systems struggle with, specifically the sudden changes in direction and speed that raiders use to defeat tracking. The guidance system appears to anticipate rather than simply follow, which implies either a very sophisticated predictive model or some kind of direct observation capability that operates through the missile's own sensors. The concept of a missile, with its own sensors capable of independently acquiring and tracking a target, is not novel in principle. Human terminal guidance munitions use this approach. But the performance of Rocketeer missiles in terms of tracking persistence and accuracy is dramatically beyond what human terminal guidance achieved. When a Rocketeer missile acquires a lock on a raider, breaking that lock requires significantly more than simple evasive maneuvers. It requires specific techniques that experienced raiders have developed through extensive trial and error, techniques that exploit specific limitations in the guidance system that took considerable effort to identify. Those techniques, the methods that experienced raiders use to defeat Rocketeer missile tracking, are worth discussing because they reveal something about the limitations built into the guidance system, which in turn tells us something about the design choices ARC made when specifying the Rocketeer's weapons. Every guidance system has limitations. The physics of tracking moving targets at speed requires trade-offs between sensitivity, response time, and computational complexity. The specific limitations of Rocketeer missile guidance are not random. They reflect deliberate design choices, and those choices tell a story about what ARC prioritized. One of the most commonly reported methods for breaking Rocketeer missile tracking involves rapid changes in altitude combined with movement into the internal spaces of structures. The missile guidance appears to struggle with tracking targets that transition through vertical planes while simultaneously entering complex indoor geometry. This suggests that the guidance system's model of the engagement environment has limitations when dealing with highly constrained three-dimensional spaces. The system may have been optimized for outdoor engagement against targets in open terrain, which would make sense given the Rocketeer's role as an open-area denial platform, and that optimization introduced blind spots in more complex indoor tracking scenarios. The implication of this limitation is interesting from a law perspective. If the Rocketeer's missiles were specifically designed for open terrain engagement, it suggests that the ARC designers who specified this system had a particular threat picture in mind that featured primarily open terrain combat. Raiders who learned to exploit indoor environments as cover against the Rocketeer were, in a sense, fighting outside the design envelope of the machine's weapons, exploiting a gap between ARC's anticipated engagement scenarios and actual human tactical adaptations. This is one of several places in ARC Raiders lore where human adaptability appears to have gotten ahead of ARC's threat modeling. The Warhead technology in Rocketeer missiles produces a distinctive detonation signature that differs from conventional explosive warheads in ways that researchers have noted as significant. The energy release profile is sharper. The blast radius is more precisely shaped relative to the approach angle, and the secondary fragmentation pattern differs from what conventional munitions would produce. These characteristics suggest a warhead design that has been optimized to maximize lethality against soft targets, specifically biological organisms, while not unnecessarily destroying the structural or technological content of the environment. This is a surgical warhead, not a brute force one. A warhead optimized to kill raiders without unnecessarily destroying the surrounding environment is consistent with the theory that ARC is interested in preserving certain things within the areas it controls. A machine designed purely for security would use the most destructive warhead available to ensure target elimination. A machine designed for security within an area where ARC has ongoing interests would use a warhead that kills the threat without damaging things nearby. The Rocketeer's warhead characteristics lean toward the latter interpretation and suggest that the environment ARC is defending is not just territory but specific things within that territory. The number of missiles that a Rocketeer carries and the pattern by which it deploys them reveals a tactical doctrine embedded in its weapons systems. The machine does not typically fire single missiles at individual targets. It fires salvos, multiple missiles in close succession, that simultaneously approach the target from slightly different angles. This salvo pattern is designed to defeat point defense responses and single dodge maneuvers. A single incoming missile can be evaded with the right timing and movement. Multiple missiles approaching from different angles and at slightly different speeds creates a much more complex defensive problem, and the Rocketeer appears to have been programmed to understand this and to exploit it. The salvo pattern also reveals something about the Rocketeer's assessment of its targets. Sending multiple missiles at a single raider is an investment of resources that a system optimizing purely for efficiency would resist if a single missile were sufficient. The fact that the Rocketeer defaults to multi-missile salvos suggests either that ARC's programming incorporates an expectation that raiders will attempt to evade single missiles, or that a single missile's hit probability against an evading target was deemed insufficient, and the salvo pattern was specified to raise the overall probability of target elimination to an acceptable threshold. Either interpretation credits ARC with a sophisticated tactical model of raider behavior. The spacing between missiles in a Rocketeer salvo has been measured by players who have survived salvo impacts and analyzed the data from their interactions. The spacing appears to be optimized based on the typical evasive movement speeds and distances that raiders can achieve. Missiles that are too closely spaced would be defeated by a single sharp evasion. Missiles that are too widely spaced give the target time to reset and deal with each missile individually. The actual spacing observed in Rocketeer salvos falls in a range that specifically challenges the evasive capability of a moving raider, neither so tight that a single dodge defeats all of them, nor so wide that they can be addressed sequentially. This spacing suggests design testing against targets with human-scale movement capabilities. The fact that Rocketeer missile salvos appear calibrated for human movement speeds is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the hypothesis that ARC had detailed knowledge of human physical capabilities before the invasion. You cannot calibrate a weapon's tactics for human-scale movement speeds without knowing what those speeds are, and knowing what those speeds are with sufficient precision to base weapons parameters on them requires either extensive prior observation or access to detailed biological data about the human form. Either pathway suggests prior knowledge that is difficult to explain if ARC encountered humanity for the first time upon arrival. The acoustic signature of Rocketeer missiles in flight is one of the most important survival tools available to raiders in Rocketeer encounters. The distinct sound of an inbound missile is recognizable to experienced raiders and provides warning time that can make the difference between survival and death. This warning time is not generous, but it is measurable, and raiders have calibrated their response drills to the specific window that missile approach sound provides. The fact that Rocketeer missiles make sound at all, rather than operating silently, is another example of ARC potentially providing deterrence through detectability. One important aspect of the Rocketeer's weaponry that is sometimes overlooked is the question of what it does not carry. We have discussed the absence of close-range engagement systems, but it is also notable that the Rocketeer does not carry what would be described as continuous fire weapons, the kind of high rate of fire systems that ground units use to create area suppression or to engage multiple targets rapidly. The Rocketeer's engagement model is one of discrete, precise, high lethality strikes rather than suppressive volume fire. This is a doctrinal choice that reflects the Rocketeer's role as a precision area denial asset rather than a general-purpose fire support platform. The precision doctrine embedded in the Rocketeer's weapons selection has interesting tactical implications that raiders have had to learn to account for. Because the Rocketeer fires discrete missiles rather than continuous streams, there are brief windows between firing cycles during which the immediate missile threat is temporarily reduced. Experienced raiders exploit these windows aggressively, using them to make movement that would be suicidal during an active missile engagement. Understanding the firing cycle of the Rocketeer, specifically the duration and predictability of the inter-salvo pause, is one of the most valuable pieces of tactical knowledge an advanced raider can have. The inter-salvo pause itself appears to vary based on the Rocketeer's assessment of the tactical situation. Longer pauses seem to occur when targets have broken line of sight or entered complex terrain, as if the system is waiting for better targeting conditions before expending more missiles. Shorter pauses seem to occur when targets are clearly visible and in the open, where the probability of successful hit is high. This variable pause behavior suggests that the Rocketeer is managing its firing decisions based on some calculation of engagement quality rather than simply cycling through a fixed fire pattern. It is making something that looks like tactical judgment. Tactical judgment in a weapons system is a significant capability. Most automated weapons systems operate on simpler engagement rules. Fire when target is within range and in line of sight. Continue firing until target is eliminated or lost. A system that modulates its firing based on a quality assessment of the engagement conditions is doing something more sophisticated. It is, in essence, choosing when to spend its resources based on an evaluation of expected return. This is closer to how a trained human sniper operates than how most automated systems are programmed to operate, and it gives the Rocketeer a tactical flexibility that straightforward rule-based systems lack. The interaction between the Rocketeer's missile systems and environmental conditions is another area of interesting complexity. In varying weather conditions, at different times of day, in areas with different terrain and structural complexity, the performance of the Rocketeer's missiles shows subtle variations that raiders have documented. Rain affects the acoustic warning time. Certain terrain types seem to affect the missile flight paths in ways consistent with the guidance systems responding to sensor artifacts created by the terrain. Time of day appears to affect the detection range at which the Rocketeer acquires targets, suggesting light-dependent sensor components alongside whatever thermal or radar sensing it uses. These environmental sensitivities are important tactical information for raiders who know to look for them. They are also interesting from a lore perspective because they suggest that the Rocketeer's weapon systems are not infinitely capable. They have tuning parameters that work well in expected conditions and perform less well in conditions at the edges of their design envelope. This is true of all real-world systems, and the Rocketeer's environmental sensitivities are in that sense a marker of engineering reality rather than fantasy. Arc makes capable machines, but not perfect ones, and the imperfections are exploitable by those who study them carefully enough. The question of why the Rocketeer's missile guidance can be defeated at all is worth asking directly. Arc is clearly capable of sophisticated engineering. The guidance systems on these missiles are impressive by any measure, yet experienced raiders have developed consistent techniques for defeating them. Is this because Arc was not trying hard enough? Or because there are fundamental physical limits on tracking accuracy that even Arc's technology cannot overcome? Or because there was a deliberate decision to make the missiles beatable as part of the deterrence rather than extermination operational doctrine? The answer is not obvious, and all three possibilities have supporters in the community. The deterrence argument has some merit. If Arc's goal is to keep raiders away from certain locations rather than to kill every raider that ever approaches, then weapons that are beatable by skilled and determined targets serve that goal. A weapon that instantly kills anyone who approaches regardless of skill or preparation would not deter, it would simply kill. A weapon that can be overcome with sufficient skill and preparation creates exactly the kind of risk-reward calculation that defines deterrence, where most people decide the risk is not worth it, but the most skilled and committed can still get through if they work hard enough. The fundamental physics argument is also compelling. No tracking system is infinitely precise. The speed and unpredictability of evasive movement creates mathematical challenges for any tracking algorithm. The techniques that defeat Rocketeer missile guidance, rapid direction changes at specific timings, altitude transitions, entry into complex geometry, are all approaches that push guidance systems to the edges of their mathematical capability. ARC may have built the best guidance system physically possible given the constraints of miniaturization and response time, and the raiders who have found the limits of that system are operating at the frontier of what the physics allows to be beaten. The information economy around Rocketeer weapon knowledge is worth noting as a lore element in its own right. Knowledge about the Rocketeer's weapons, specifically how to defeat them, is valuable and is treated as such by the communities that have assembled around raider operations. Raiders who have developed effective anti-Rocketeer techniques are respected figures, their knowledge sought after by those who need to operate in Rocketeer-contested areas. This knowledge economy is a human response to an ARC threat, and it represents one of the ways in which humanity is adapting to ARC's presence, in ways that ARC may not have fully anticipated. The adaptation dynamic is important because it suggests a race between ARC's static weapons systems and humanity's dynamic tactical knowledge. The Rocketeer arrives with fixed specifications. Raiders study it, find its weaknesses, develop techniques to exploit them, and share those techniques through whatever information networks exist in the post-invasion world. ARC's response to this process, or its apparent lack of response, is itself an interesting data point. If ARC were continuously updating the Rocketeer systems in response to observed human techniques, the techniques that work today should stop working tomorrow. The apparent persistence of effective anti-Rocketeer techniques over time suggests either that ARC is not updating its deployed machines in response to raider behavior, or that the updates are infrequent enough that techniques remain valid for meaningful periods. The persistence of vulnerability suggests that the Rocketeer, despite its sophistication, is not a learning system in the fullest sense. It does not appear to change its behavior based on accumulated engagements in the way that a machine intelligence optimized for tactical adaptation would. This limitation is one of the most important findings to emerge from the community of raiders who have studied the Rocketeer seriously, because it means that investment in understanding the machine's weapons system and developing techniques against it has lasting value. You are not learning a moving target. You are learning something fixed that can be fully understood if you put in enough effort. The explosive yield of Rocketeer missiles has been a subject of debate in the raider community because the relationship between missile size and damage is more complex than simple physics would predict. Small missiles produce damage effects that seem disproportionate to their physical dimensions, suggesting either unusually energy-dense warhead material or an energy release mechanism that is not purely chemical. The debate about whether ARC missiles use some form of non-chemical energy release is ongoing, but the data from actual engagements consistently shows damage patterns that push the edges of what conventional explanation can account for. The visual signature of a Rocketeer missile in flight has become one of the most recognizable images in ARC raiders. The particular color of its exhaust plume, the trail it leaves in the air, the way it curves through space following a target. These visual elements have made the Rocketeer's missiles among the most visually distinctive aspects of the game's threat environment. This visual distinctiveness serves a gameplay purpose, helping raiders track incoming fire and time their responses. But from a lore perspective, it also tells us something about the physical processes occurring in the missile's propulsion and guidance systems. Processes that produce specific visual signatures as a byproduct of their operation. The secondary effects of Rocketeer missile detonations, the persistent environmental effects that remain after impact, are a final aspect of the weapons system worth examining. Detonation areas show effects that go beyond immediate blast damage, including lingering energy signatures, material changes in struck surfaces, and in some cases, apparent disruption of electronic systems in proximity. These secondary effects are not typical of conventional explosive weapons, and again point toward an energy release mechanism in the warhead that is more complex than simple chemical detonation. For raiders, these secondary effects create additional hazards in areas that have been recently struck and add another dimension of danger to operating in active Rocketeer engagement zones. Chapter 4: The High-Value Locations, What the Rocketeer Guards. If you want to understand what the Rocketeer is, start by asking what it is guarding. The tactical logic of deploying a heavy aerial denial asset at a specific location, rather than randomly distributing such assets across all contested areas, is one of the most revealing pieces of evidence available for understanding ARCs. Priorities. The Rocketeer is not everywhere. It is somewhere specific, and the specific somewhere that it chooses to occupy tells us things about ARC that ground-level observation alone could not reveal. The category of locations that the game designates as high value and that Rocketeer deployment patterns consistently reflect is broad enough to include several different types of sites, but narrow enough to exclude vast categories of locations that raiders might consider important. Understanding what is and is not in the Rocketeer's protection profile is as informative as understanding what is in it. The absence of Rocketeers from certain areas is data just as much as their presence in others. The types of locations most consistently associated with Rocketeer activity fall into several recognizable patterns. First, there are locations with significant structural integrity, buildings or installations that are still largely intact despite the ARC invasion and the damage it has caused to the surrounding environment. These intact structures stand out visually in the game world as areas where something prevented the usual level of deterioration and damage. The Rocketeer's presence above these sites suggests that their preservation was not accidental. Second, there are locations with identifiable ARC hardware concentrations, areas where the density of ARC machinery or ARC-installed infrastructure is noticeably higher than the surrounding region. These are not just patrol zones for ARC machines. They are areas where ARC has apparently installed or modified physical systems in ways that are integrated into the environment. The Rocketeer over these areas is protecting an investment, not just a territory. Third, there are locations that appear to have been important human installations prior to the ARC invasion, facilities that served critical functions in pre-invasion society, such as communications infrastructure, energy production, research facilities, or administrative centers. ARC's interest in these sites suggests that they retain value under ARC's operational framework for reasons that may or may not overlap with why they were valuable to humanity. A communications tower that was important to human coordination might be interesting to ARC for entirely different reasons related to its physical location or the infrastructure it is built upon. The overlap between pre-invasion human importance and current ARC importance at specific sites is one of the more interesting patterns in the location data. If ARC were simply repurposing human infrastructure for ARC purposes, you would expect a strong correlation between pre-invasion importance and ARC protection level. If ARC had its own entirely different criteria for site importance, you would expect a weak or random correlation. The actual pattern appears to be somewhere in between, with some pre-invasion important sites coinciding with high ARC activity and others showing no particular ARC interest, which suggests that ARC has its own criteria that sometimes but not always overlaps with human importance criteria. Understanding what ARC's criteria for site importance actually are is one of the core lore mysteries of ARC raiders, and one that the Rocketeer's deployment patterns provide evidence for. If you map the Rocketeer protected sites and look for what they have in common beyond simple importance, patterns start to emerge that point towards specific characteristics rather than general strategic value. These characteristics include things like specific geological features, particular proximity to pre-identified points of interest, elevation or depth characteristics, and in some cases, proximity to what appear to be natural resource deposits that were not necessarily significant in the pre-invasion human economic context, but might be in ARC's operational framework. The geological dimension of ARC's site selection is particularly interesting and underexplored in most raider community discussions. ARC is doing something on Earth that is more than just an occupation. The scale of its physical presence, the permanence of some of its installations, and the specificity of its location selections all suggest an operation with a particular physical goal rather than a pure military or territorial objective. A purely territorial occupation force would distribute its assets to maximize coverage. ARC's clustering around specific sites suggests it is maximizing access to specific things rather than territory in general, and those specific things appear to have a physical substrate tied to particular locations. Raiders who have managed to access Rocketeer-protected sites and survive long enough to conduct meaningful observation consistently report finding things that do not fit neatly into the category of military infrastructure. There are processes happening at these sites that seem oriented toward extraction, modification, or analysis rather than production or fortification. Machines are doing things to the environment rather than building into it. Material is moving in specific directions rather than simply being stockpiled. The activity at these sites has a directionality and a purposefulness that is evident even to observers who do not understand the specific processes they are watching. The implications of extractive activity at high-value sites protected by Rocketeers are significant for understanding ARC's presence on Earth. An occupation force that extracts, rather than simply occupies, is engaged in a fundamentally different kind of operation than most conventional invasion narratives assume. It is not trying to subjugate a population or control a territory for its own sake. It is taking something from the territory, and when it has taken what it came for, the territory presumably becomes less important. This transactional relationship with Earth suggests that ARC's timeline may be defined not by when it can achieve military dominance, but by when it has extracted whatever it came for. And the Rocketeer is protecting that extraction timeline. The varying intensity of Rocketeer activity at different sites over time provides evidence for this extraction model. Sites that show very high initial Rocketeer activity sometimes show reduced activity over extended observation periods, as if the site has become less important to ARC after a period of intensive operation. This reduction in protection level would be strange for a territorial occupation force that would presumably want to maintain control of all captured territory. But for an extraction operation, it makes sense. Once a site has yielded what was valuable at it, the cost of maintaining heavy aerial denial assets there no longer justifies the investment, and those assets can be redeployed to sites where extraction is still ongoing. The timing and pattern of Rocketeer redeployments between sites is something that the most dedicated radar researchers have been attempting to track and document. If the pattern of redeployment corresponds to the completion of specific extraction activities at sites, it would provide strong evidence for the extraction model and would also potentially allow researchers to predict where Rocketeers will appear next by identifying sites where extractable resources remain. This kind of predictive capability would be enormously valuable to radar operations and would represent one of the more remarkable intelligence achievements possible given the tools available. The sites where Rocketeer activity has increased over time rather than decreasing are equally informative. These escalating protection sites are presumably locations where ARC is finding or accessing something of increasing value, or where the threat to the site from raiders has escalated to the point where heavier protection is justified. Either interpretation provides useful information. The first tells you where ARC is finding more of whatever it is looking for. The second tells you where radar activity has been significant enough to trigger a defensive response escalation. The physical transformation of Rocketeer-protected sites over time is visible to raiders who revisit locations across extended periods. Sites that start as recognizable pre-invasion structures gradually become less recognizable as ARC processes work on them. Structures are modified, materials are removed or rearranged, and in some cases, entirely new features appear that were not present in earlier observations. This ongoing physical transformation is evidence of active operation rather than simple occupation, confirming that ARC is doing things to these sites rather than merely holding them. The pace of physical transformation appears to vary significantly across sites and over time. Some locations show rapid transformation that dramatically alters the site over a period that raiders can observe within a single raiding season. Others show slower, more subtle changes that accumulate over longer timeframes into equally dramatic final states. The rate of transformation might reflect the intensity of ARC's interest and resource investment at each site, with higher priority sites receiving more intensive processing that produces faster visible change. The question of what raiders might find if they could access a Rocketeer-protected site before ARC's transformation process had fully run its course is one of the game's most compelling implicit narrative threads. A site in early transformation might still contain readable evidence of what ARC was doing and why, information that a fully processed site might no longer provide. Raiders who have managed to access sites in earlier stages of the transformation process report finding information artifacts, environmental evidence, and technological clues that more advanced sites do not contain. The Rocketeer in this framing is also protecting the legibility of these sites from radar observation, ensuring that the evidence of ARC's work is not accessed before it is fully processed and presumably beyond useful interpretation. The strategic geography of Rocketeer protected sites, their distribution across the game world, is worth examining at a macro level because it reveals patterns that individual site observations cannot. Looking at the collection of Rocketeer defended locations as a whole, rather than individually, shows a non-random distribution that suggests spatial logic underlying ARC's site selection. The sites are not clustered in ways that would reflect pre-invasion population centers or economic geography. They cluster in ways that suggest a different spatial logic, one that players and researchers have been attempting to decode by looking at geological maps, topographical data, and historical records of the areas. One hypothesis that has gained traction in the Raider research community is that Rocketeer-protected sites correspond to locations with specific subsurface characteristics. The geological data for these sites shows consistencies that are not visible on the surface, common features at depth that might only be apparent to something with the sensor capability to examine subsurface conditions at a resolution that human technology could not easily achieve. If ARC is selecting sites based on subsurface data, it has geological knowledge of Earth that goes beyond anything humans mapped in the pre-invasion period, which is itself a significant piece of lore information. The intersection of Rocketeer site geography with known pre-invasion research activities is another analytical thread worth pulling. Some of the sites that show the highest levels of ARC protection and Rocketeer activity overlap with locations that were the subjects of pre-invasion research into specific phenomena: natural resource deposits, archaeological sites, underground formations, or anomalous physical observations. Whether this overlap reflects ARC's awareness of pre-invasion human research findings, or whether both human researchers and ARC independently identified significant sites through different methods, is an open question with significant implications. The physical protection that buildings and structures at Rocketeer-defended sites receive is itself worth noting as a form of lore evidence. ARC machines at these sites do not damage the structures they operate within or adjacent to. This is in marked contrast to ARC machine behavior in unprotected areas, where collateral damage to the environment is common. The careful treatment of structures at high-value sites is consistent with ARC protecting something within or beneath those structures. And it is another piece of the picture that distinguishes these locations as qualitatively different from the rest of the contested environment. The human history of Rocketeer-protected sites, what these places were, and what happened in them before the ARC invasion, is a dimension of lore exploration that yields particularly rich returns for researchers who investigate it. The pre-invasion identity of a site often provides clues to what might be of interest there now. A location that was a research facility might contain equipment, data, or materials that are interesting to ARC for their own properties. A location that was an energy installation might be interesting for its access to specific physical systems. The pre-invasion history is not always determinative, but it is often suggestive. The abandonment process at some Rocketeer-protected sites, the transition from active ARC operation to ARC withdrawal that raiders occasionally observe, is one of the more cryptic events in the game. When ARC moves on from a site, it does not simply leave. There are processes of clearing and modification that occur as the ARC presence winds down. Processes that appear designed to eliminate evidence of what was done there and to render the site less useful for anyone who might come after. The Rocketeer, present right up to the end of active operation, presumably covers this withdrawal process before itself being redeployed. The targeting of extraction or collection activities by raiders who understand what is happening at Rocketeer-protected sites is one of the most interesting tactical and narrative threads in ARC Raiders. A raider who can disrupt ARC's collection activities at a high-value site is doing something more meaningful than simply looting resources. They are interfering with whatever larger project ARC is pursuing on Earth, which may ultimately have implications for everyone. The Rocketeer is not just protecting resources that raiders might want, it is protecting a process that matters at a scale beyond any individual raid. The relationship between the Rocketeer and what might be called ARC's mission objective on Earth is ultimately the deepest question that examination of its deployment patterns raises. If ARC's activity is directed toward a specific goal, and if the Rocketeer is protecting the sites most critical to achieving that goal, then the Rocketeer's deployment map is essentially a map of ARC's priorities. And if raiders could read that map clearly enough, they would know not just where the resources are, but what ARC is trying to do with them. That knowledge would be among the most valuable things any raider could possess. And the Rocketeer, for all its lethality, is arguably the most significant pointer toward obtaining it. Chapter 5. Raider Encounters, Survival Accounts and Tactical Knowledge. The folklore of Rocketeer encounters occupies a significant portion of the oral and written culture that has developed among raiders since the Ark invasion began. Stories about close calls, narrow escapes, and the rare occasions when a raider or a raider team managed to successfully engage and defeat a Rocketeer are told and retold in whatever gathering places exist for people who raid together. These stories are not just entertainment. They are repositories of tactical knowledge, datasets built from the lived experience of people who survived to tell the tale. The first encounter story is a particular genre within Rocketeer folklore. The narrative of a raider who sees a Rocketeer for the first time without knowing what it is, or knowing what it is, but without having experienced its capabilities directly, follows recognizable patterns that suggest the experience of first encountering the Rocketeer leaves a strong impression that shapes subsequent behavior. Almost every experienced raider can recall their first Rocketeer encounter in considerable detail, usually because it ended their run abruptly, sometimes disastrously. The common elements of first encounter stories are informative about the Rocketeer's effectiveness as a design. Raiders consistently report that the moment between first seeing or hearing the Rocketeer and realizing they are in serious danger is longer than it should be. There is something about the machine's initial appearance, its distant silhouette, its patrol behavior, that does not immediately communicate the level of threat it represents. It looks like something manageable until it is not, and the transition from manageable to catastrophic happens faster than most unprepared raiders can process and respond to. This delayed threat recognition is one of the Rocketeer's most effective attributes, and one that appears to be, at minimum in part, a feature of its design rather than an accident. The orbital patrol behavior, the relatively slow movement outside of active engagement, and the visible profile that is formidable but not immediately overwhelming, all contribute to a first impression that underestimates the machine's danger. Experienced raiders who have learned to recalibrate their threat assessment recognize the Rocketeer as maximum priority the moment it appears, but this recalibration is a learned response, not an intuitive one. The survivorship bias in Rocketeer encounter stories is worth acknowledging explicitly. The stories we hear are told by people who survived. The strategies that are described as effective are described by people who lived to describe them. This is a limitation of the dataset, because strategies that fail to keep people alive are not represented in the corpus of survivor accounts. The tactical knowledge derived from these stories is therefore systematically biased toward approaches that work in some scenarios for some people, and the approaches that consistently fail are underrepresented because the people who tried them are not available to report on their experience. Correcting for survivorship bias in Rocketeer tactical knowledge requires making specific efforts to reconstruct what happened in failed encounters, rather than just cataloguing successful approaches. Raiders who observe other raiders getting killed by Rocketeers report on the behavioral patterns that preceded the kill, and these observer reports provide some data on what the failed strategies look like. Compilation of observer reports alongside survivor accounts gives a fuller picture than either data source alone, and that fuller picture is substantially bleaker than a pure reading of survival stories would suggest. One of the most consistent findings across survivor accounts is the importance of early recognition over reactive response. Raiders who survive Rocketeer encounters overwhelmingly describe having identified the threat early enough to make proactive rather than reactive decisions. The raider who sees the Rocketeer before it sees them, who identifies its patrol pattern and plots a route that avoids its detection envelope, has a dramatically better survival rate than the raider who first becomes aware of the Rocketeer when missiles are already inbound. This emphasis on detection-first tactical doctrine has become one of the defining characteristics of experienced raider operational style. The tools and techniques that raiders use to extend their Rocketeer early warning capability are a fascinating area of emergent equipment development within the game's economy. Items that enhance auditory awareness, visual detection range, or threat identification speed are all disproportionately valuable in Rocketeer presence scenarios. The market for these items, if we can use that word loosely, reflects the premium that experienced raiders place on early detection capability. A raider who can see the Rocketeer first and make an informed decision about how to proceed is a raider who has converted a potentially lethal encounter into a manageable tactical problem. Team dynamics in Rocketeer encounter scenarios are significantly different from team dynamics in ground-based engagements, and the accounts from team raids provide some of the most interesting tactical information available. Teams that succeed in Rocketeer presence areas consistently employ role differentiation that dedicates at least one team member to persistent Rocketeer monitoring, while others execute the primary objective. This dedicated observer role is not needed against most ground-based threats, but becomes essential in Rocketeer scenarios because the machine's aerial position gives it observation angles that no single raider can cover while simultaneously doing anything else. The communication protocols that successful raider teams use to manage Rocketeer information during active raids have been studied as a model for information management under pressure. Real-time sharing of Rocketeer position, flight path, and engagement status allows team members to make coordinated decisions about movement timing, cover selection, and objective approach that individual raiders cannot replicate. Teams that can effectively communicate Rocketeer positional data see dramatically better outcomes in Rocketeer presence scenarios than teams that operate with individual awareness only. The psychological dimension of Rocketeer encounters is something that Survivor accounts address with unusual directness for a game's lore context. Raiders describe specific mental and physical states during Rocketeer engagements that include heightened alertness, narrowed focus, reduced peripheral awareness, and occasional decision-making failures under the pressure of having guided missiles tracking toward them. These psychological effects are not unique to the Rocketeer, but are particularly intense in Rocketeer encounters because the combination of missile tracking, altitude advantage, and heavy armor creates a threat picture that places exceptional cognitive demand on the target. The phenomenon of Rocketeer-induced paralysis, the momentary inability to take any action when the machine first achieves a targeting lock, is described in enough Survivor accounts to suggest it is a reliable psychological response rather than an individual reaction. Something about the combination of threat cues that the Rocketeer presents, the sound of the tracking system, the sight of missiles beginning their approach trajectory, and the knowledge that the machine is heavily armed and well protected, creates a brief window of behavioral inhibition that experienced raiders have had to specifically train themselves to overcome. Breaking through that inhibition window is itself a skill, one that separates those who react immediately from those who freeze. The specific training approaches that experienced raiders have developed to address Rocketeer paralysis are largely informal, improvised responses to a well-recognized problem. They involve deliberate exposure to Rocketeer encounters in lower-stakes contexts, development of immediate action drills that reduce the decision-making load during the critical first seconds of an engagement, and mental rehearsal of response sequences that can be executed without conscious deliberation once the relevant cues are detected. These training approaches are shared within raider communities and represent a form of institutional knowledge development happening in response to a very specific threat. The distinction between encounters with single Rocketeers and encounters with multiple simultaneous Rocketeer units is worth addressing because the two scenarios are qualitatively different in ways beyond simply doubling the threat. Multiple Rocketeer deployments at a single site create mutual coverage gaps that eliminate most of the escape vectors that experienced raiders rely on in single Rocketeer scenarios. The techniques that work against one Rocketeer frequently fail against two, because those techniques depend on the existence of blind spots and orbital timing windows that two coordinated machines eliminate. This is another piece of evidence that the Rocketeer was designed with awareness of how it would be countered. The rare documented cases of raiders successfully defeating a Rocketeer in direct combat, rather than evading it, are among the most studied accounts in the raider community. These accounts are analyzed for commonalities that might reveal generalizable conditions under which direct engagement is viable. The common factors identified across successful direct engagement accounts include specific equipment loadouts with high sustained damage output, team compositions that allow fire from multiple simultaneous angles, engagement conditions that reduce the Rocketeer's ability to use altitude to escape fire, and in many cases, prior damage to the Rocketeer from other interactions that reduced its resilience before the final engagement. The equipment requirements for viable direct Rocketeer engagement establish a high bar that most raiders cannot meet casually. This high bar is itself a form of gating that controls access to Rocketeer-defended locations, ensuring that only raiders who have invested significantly in preparation and capability can realistically contest the machine on its own terms. This access control function may be intentional in ARC's design, creating a situation where the Rocketeer filters out lower capability threats while presenting a meaningful challenge to higher capability ones. The after-action analysis culture that has developed among raiders who engage Rocketeer encounters is one of the healthier adaptive responses to the machine's threat. Rather than simply writing off Rocketeer encounters as inevitable defeats and adjusting tactical plans to avoid them, some raiders have committed to systematic analysis of what happened in engagements, what decisions were made, what the outcomes were, and what different decisions might have produced. This analytical culture has produced some of the most reliable tactical knowledge available about the Rocketeer, knowledge that is significantly better calibrated than the anecdotal survivor stories that form most people's Rocketeer information base. The sharing of this analytical knowledge across raider communities faces practical challenges given the communication environment of the post-invasion world. But the value of the information is high enough that significant effort goes into transmission and preservation. Raiders who possess deep tactical knowledge about Rocketeer encounters are assets to any team and are treated accordingly by the communities that value operational effectiveness. The knowledge itself has become a form of social currency, and the Rocketeer, by creating the need for that specialized knowledge, has inadvertently created a valued new role within Raider social structures. The experience gap between first-time Rocketeer encounters and experienced Rocketeer management is one of the starkest in ARC Raiders because the Rocketeer requires such a specific and non-intuitive set of responses that experience cannot easily be replaced by general combat competence. A Raider who is excellent against ground units but has never encountered a Rocketeer is not better prepared for a Rocketeer than a mediocre ground combatant. The skills required are different enough that they must be learned specifically for this threat, which means the Rocketeer represents a genuine novice trap that is particularly punishing for otherwise capable players who encounter it unprepared. The psychological aftermath of Rocketeer kills. The death of a Raider with significant gear and time investment at the hands of a Rocketeer is something that survivor accounts reference in ways that suggest lasting impact beyond the immediate loss. Players describe Rocketeer-caused deaths differently from other game deaths, with more emotional weight and more detailed recollection. This heightened emotional impact of Rocketeer kills may reflect the combination of the machine's dramatic presentation, the guided missile engagement that gives the target a moment of knowing what is coming, and the particularly punishing consequence of losing accumulated resources to this specific threat. The cultural significance of the Rocketeer within the player community, the way it has become a shared reference point and symbol of the game's punishing difficulty, is worth acknowledging as a lore element in its own right. The Rocketeer has generated a specific vocabulary among players, a set of terms and references that mark shared experience with the machine and that serve as indicators of membership in the community of people who have been playing long enough to have had significant Rocketeer encounters. This cultural weight is not designed into the machine, but emerged from the consistent intensity of the experience it creates. The development of anti-Rocketeer specialist roles within larger Raider operations is a natural organizational response to the machine's threat and represents one of the more interesting aspects of how the Rocketeer has shaped Raider social and operational structures. In teams large enough to support specialization, having a dedicated Rocketeer specialist, someone whose equipment and training is specifically optimized for managing this threat, becomes an operational priority when missions are planned for Rocketeer presence areas. The existence of this specialization creates career paths and status hierarchies within Raider communities that did not exist before the Rocketeer made them necessary. The comparison between different players' Rocketeer encounter experiences highlights how much individual variability exists in the threat it represents. A player with specific equipment, situational awareness skills, and trained responses to the machine's behavior patterns experiences it as a manageable though serious challenge. A player without those specific preparations experiences it as essentially instant death in many scenarios. This enormous spread in effective threat level based on preparation is one of the things that makes the Rocketeer particularly effective as a gatekeeping mechanism for high-value areas. The role of luck in Rocketeer encounter outcomes is something that even experienced raiders acknowledge. Despite all the tactical knowledge and preparation, the randomness of the Rocketeer's patrol timing relative to player arrival, the specific conditions of visibility and terrain at the moment of encounter, and the precise behavior of missile tracking in the specific circumstances of each engagement, all introduce stochastic elements that no amount of preparation can fully eliminate. The best players manage luck by reducing exposure to its effects, but they cannot eliminate it, and the Rocketeer's unpredictable elements ensure that even the most prepared raider faces genuine risk in every encounter. The emotional experience of successfully surviving a Rocketeer encounter, and especially of successfully extracting from a Rocketeer-defended area, is described in survivor accounts with a consistent intensity that sets it apart from other successful outcomes in the game. Something about successfully navigating the specific combination of threats that the Rocketeer presents, about defeating its area denial and getting out with the objective, feels more significant than other achievements. This heightened reward feeling is in part a function of the genuinely elevated risk, and it creates a positive feedback loop that motivates continued engagement with high Rocketeer presence areas despite the danger. The accounts of raiders who have developed what might be called Rocketeer mastery, the ability to consistently operate in Rocketeer presence areas with acceptable risk levels, provide a model for what experienced engagement with this threat looks like. These raiders describe the experience of operating under a Rocketeer as demanding but manageable once the machine's systems and patterns are sufficiently understood. The transition from Rocketeer as an existential threat to Rocketeer as a serious but manageable obstacle is one of the more satisfying skill progressions available in Arc Raiders, and the machine's consistency of behavior, its non-learning nature, ensures that mastery earned through study and practice remains valid. The body of knowledge about Rocketeer encounters that has accumulated within the Raider community represents one of the more remarkable examples of emergent knowledge production in the game's world. People with diverse backgrounds, skills, and prior knowledge have contributed fragments of observation and experience that have been compiled and synthesized into something approaching a comprehensive understanding of the machine's behavior. No single raider could have developed this knowledge alone. It required the pooled experience of many encounters, many deaths, and many near misses to build the complete picture. The Rocketeer, in generating this collective knowledge production, has inadvertently strengthened the communities that oppose it. Chapter 6. The Rocketeer in Arc's Military Hierarchy. The Arc machine hierarchy is not something the game makes explicit in a way that allows clean, definitive statements about it. What exists is a body of observable evidence, the behavior of different machine types, their interactions with each other, their deployment patterns, and the apparent logic of their role differentiation that allows players and researchers to make inferential statements about how Arc's force structure is organized. The Rocketeer's place in this hierarchy is one of the more interesting questions within that analytical space, and it is one that has generated significant discussion. The most straightforward way to think about Arc's machine hierarchy is in terms of capability and deployment cost. Simple machines that can be produced and deployed in large numbers and that perform relatively basic functions occupy the base of the hierarchy. More sophisticated machines with specialized capabilities, higher resistance, and greater individual combat effectiveness occupy progressively higher levels. The Rocketeer, with its aerial capability, heavy armament, substantial armor, and apparent deployment as a premium asset in high-value contexts, clearly occupies a relatively high position in this capability-based hierarchy. But capability alone does not fully describe a machine's position in a military hierarchy. Role is equally important. A highly capable but narrowly specialized machine might rank lower in strategic importance than a more moderately capable machine with broader applicability. The Rocketeer's specialization in aerial area denial gives it a role that is both critical and irreplaceable within its operational envelope. No ground-based machine can perform the Rocketeer's function. This irreplaceability elevates its strategic importance beyond what pure capability comparison would suggest. The relationship between the Rocketeer and what appear to be command function machines within Ark's force structure is worth examining. Some Ark machines show behaviors that suggest they are not just combatants but coordinators, units that manage the positioning and response patterns of other machines in their vicinity. Whether the Rocketeer is one of these command function machines, a coordinated machine, or something that operates semi-independently is not fully clear from available evidence. The coordination behaviors observed in Rocketeer encounters could be consistent with any of these possibilities. The hypothesis that the Rocketeer functions as a sensor and coordination node for local Ark operations, rather than simply as an armed aerial unit, is one of the more compelling organizational models that researchers have advanced. From altitude, the Rocketeer has observation angles that ground units lack. If it is sharing this aerial observation with ground units in real time, it effectively provides tactical coordination that dramatically improves the performance of the entire local force. A Rocketeer that is acting as an aerial eye for a network of ground forces is far more valuable than the sum of its individual combat capabilities. The observation sharing hypothesis is supported by some behavioral evidence from radar encounters. When a Rocketeer is active in an area, the ground-based Ark machines in that area behave differently than they do when the Rocketeer is absent or when the Rocketeer has been destroyed. They show faster response times, better positional coordination, and more effective use of cover and movement that suggests they have access to better situational awareness than their own sensor systems would provide. This behavioral difference in ground units under Rocketeer coverage is one of the more compelling pieces of evidence for the aerial observation sharing model. If the Rocketeer is functioning as an observation node for ground forces, its destruction becomes more valuable than simply eliminating an aerial threat. It degrades the entire local Ark force's tactical effectiveness by removing the aerial observation layer that was improving their performance. Raiders who have destroyed Rocketeers and then observed subsequent changes in ground unit behavior report exactly this kind of degradation, with ground machines becoming less coordinated and more predictable after Rocketeer loss. This finding has implications for optimal engagement prioritization in high Ark density areas. The question of whether the Rocketeer issues instructions to ground forces or simply shares observational data is a distinction that matters for understanding its position in the hierarchy. A machine that commands others is functionally a leader, regardless of how its hardware might compare to those it commands. A machine that only shares data is a specialized sensor platform. The behavioral evidence from radar observations falls somewhere in between these poles. Ground machines under Rocketeer coverage show adaptations that go beyond simply benefiting from better situational awareness and suggest responses to specific directional inputs, which leans towards something closer to command function than pure data sharing. The Ark hierarchy at higher levels above the individual machine-type interactions that raiders can observe directly is almost entirely speculative from available evidence. But there are hints in the structure of Ark's operations, the purposeful deployment of resources, the apparent prioritization of certain activities over others, that suggest a decision-making architecture that operates at a level significantly above individual machines. The Rocketeer's deployment decisions, specifically the judgment calls about which locations are important enough to warrant Rocketeer protection, presumably come from somewhere in that higher architecture, and the Rocketeer is executing those decisions rather than making them. The concept of the Rocketeer as an executor of higher-level decisions rather than an autonomous strategic actor is consistent with what we can observe. It does not appear to make strategic choices about which locations to protect. It is placed where it is placed and performs its function within that placement. But within its operational envelope, it makes tactical decisions about engagement, timing, and missile expenditure that require something more than simple rule following. The division between strategic placement by a higher authority and tactical autonomy within that placement describes the Rocketeer's operating model fairly well. The relationship between the Rocketeer and Ark machines of apparently greater individual capability is worth examining. There are Ark machines that appear to be more individually powerful than the Rocketeer in terms of raw combat performance, more armored, more heavily armed, more destructive in direct engagement. Yet these machines are not typically found at the same locations as Rocketeers. The distribution of elite ground units and Rocketeer aerial units suggests that they serve different operational needs rather than being fungible options. That ARC deploys the specific asset type appropriate to the specific threat environment, rather than simply deploying its most powerful assets everywhere. This situational deployment philosophy suggests a relatively sophisticated resource management approach within ARC's operational framework. Rather than flooding every location with maximum capability, ARC apparently performs something like a threat assessment and deploys the appropriate level and type of response. The Rocketeer appears in the deployment calculus when a location requires aerial denial specifically, not simply when a location is valuable enough to warrant heavy protection. This specificity of deployment criteria is itself evidence of organizational sophistication. The Rocketeer's interaction with what appear to be electronic or sensor disruption systems used by some raiders provides interesting hierarchy-relevant data. Raiders who employ electronic countermeasure approaches report that the Rocketeer shows specific responses to these measures that differ from how ground units respond. The difference in response patterns suggests either that the Rocketeer's electronic systems are architected differently from ground unit systems, or that the Rocketeer has different vulnerability profiles to specific types of electronic interference, or that there is a hierarchy-level response protocol for electronic attack that differentiates between machine types. Any of these possibilities is interesting, but the last one is particularly suggestive of the kind of organized hierarchical management that would imply a sophisticated ARC command structure. The logistics of Rocketeer deployment, how ARC gets these machines to where they need to be, intersects with hierarchy questions in interesting ways. Ground units can presumably move themselves from one location to another, under direction. The Rocketeer can fly, but where does it fly from? There must be staging points, launch facilities or operational bases from which Rocketeers are deployed into their operational areas. The logistics of that deployment chain require organizational infrastructure that implies hierarchy because something is managing the deployment pipeline. Raiders who have attempted to trace Rocketeer movements between operational assignments have had limited success due to the obvious difficulties of tracking an aerial machine that is actively hostile to observation. But some partial tracking data has suggested that Rocketeers do not appear to come from random directions when they arrive at new locations. They arrive from specific headings that, when plotted against the game's geography, point towards specific areas that might represent ARC staging or support infrastructure. Following those bearings is a research thread that some dedicated players have pursued with variable success. The longevity of individual Rocketeer units in specific deployments is another aspect of hierarchy and logistics that yields interesting data. Some Rocketeer-patrolled locations have been observed by raiders over extended periods, and the machine or machines present have shown consistent characteristics over time that suggest either the same unit maintained in place for an extended period or replacement units with identical characteristics being cycled in. The operational continuity at some locations implies either very long deployment cycles for individual units or very efficient replacement logistics, and either scenario tells us something about ARC's operational capacity. The concept of a Rocketeer being specifically attuned to a particular location's defense requirements over extended periods, building up detailed knowledge of that location's geometry and the raider approach patterns it has historically experienced, is an interesting model with significant tactical implications. A machine that has been guarding the same location for a long time would have accumulated experiential data about how raiders attack that location. If that data informs the machine's behavior in any way, long-tenured Rocketeers would be meaningfully more dangerous in their specific assigned locations than freshly deployed units would be, because they would have adapted their patrol patterns and response protocols to counter the specific attack approaches they have faced before. The evidence for or against location-specific adaptation in Rocketeer behavior is limited, but not entirely absent. Raiders who revisit the same Rocketeer-defended locations over time report subtle changes in patrol behavior that could be consistent with adaptation, or could reflect external programming changes. The distinction between adaptive learning from experience and periodic external reprogramming from ARC's command structure is difficult to make from raider observations alone, but it matters for understanding what kind of machine the Rocketeer is at a fundamental level. The presence of the Rocketeer in Ark's hierarchy also raises questions about what Ark's force structure looks like in terms of the balance between general purpose and specialized units. The Rocketeer is clearly a specialized unit. Its capabilities and its vulnerability profile both reflect a narrow optimization for a specific mission. Ark's deployment of specialized units alongside general-purpose ones suggests a military philosophy that values operational effectiveness over standardization, accepting the logistical complexity of specialized assets because the operational advantages justify the cost. This philosophy is not universal among military organizations, and Ark's apparent embrace of it tells us something about how Ark approaches the problem of military force design. The apparent absence of an equivalent to the Rocketeer's specialized aerial role in Ark's other documented machine types is worth noting. Ark has machines that can operate at various heights, machines that move in various ways, and machines with various weapon configurations. But the Rocketeer's specific combination of sustained aerial operation, heavy armament, and area denial specialization appears to be unique within the observable Ark force structure. This uniqueness, the fact that nothing else Ark deploys does exactly what the Rocketeer does, underlines its importance to Ark's operational playbook in a way that having multiple machines with similar capabilities would not. The Rocketeer's uniqueness also means that understanding it in depth, knowing its capabilities, limitations, deployment patterns, and behavioral protocols provides knowledge with high strategic value that cannot be displaced by knowledge of similar machines. The Rocketeer information advantage is not diluted by adjacent information about similar threats, because there are no similar threats. This concentration of value in a single machine type has motivated the significant research investment that the Raider community has made in studying it. And the depth of understanding that has developed as a result represents one of the more significant collective intellectual achievements of the community. Within the hierarchy of threats that Raiders face, the Rocketeer occupies a specific position that is not simply defined by its raw capability. It is defined by the combination of its capability, its operational role, its deployment context, and its behavioral characteristics. Understanding a threat means not just knowing how hard it hits, but knowing when and why and how it appears, and what options it forces you to choose between. In all of these dimensions, the Rocketeer represents one of the most interesting and complex cases in Ark Raiders, and its position in the hierarchy reflects the genuine sophistication of the machine and of Ark's force design more broadly. The Rocketeer's role in Ark's military hierarchy is ultimately inseparable from the larger question of what Ark is trying to accomplish and how that mission is organized. A hierarchy is only meaningful in relation to the objectives it is pursuing. The Rocketeer serves those objectives in a specific, irreplaceable way. Understanding its place in the hierarchy requires understanding the objectives, and understanding the objectives requires understanding evidence that the Rocketeer itself provides. The analysis feeds back on itself, each piece of information enriching the interpretation of the others, and that interconnectedness is one of the things that makes deep engagement with Ark Raiders lore as rewarding as it is. Chapter 7: Theories, Mysteries, and Open Questions about the Rocketeer. The lore of Ark Raiders, including everything that can be said about the Rocketeer, is built on incomplete information. That incompleteness is not a flaw. It is a feature that has driven some of the most interesting analytical work in the game's community. The open questions around the Rocketeer are not gaps waiting to be filled by future content drops alone. They are genuine interpretive puzzles that reward careful thinking about available evidence. In this chapter, we're going to take the evidence we have assembled and push it into its speculative frontier, examining the theories that have the most evidentiary support and the mysteries that remain genuinely unresolved. The most fundamental open question about the Rocketeer is also the most difficult to answer. Does it have anything approaching awareness? The behavioral evidence is genuinely ambiguous. On one hand, behaviors like adaptive patrol timing, salvo pattern calibration, and apparent target quality assessment all suggest processing that goes beyond simple rule execution. On the other hand, the apparent absence of genuine learning over time, the consistency of behavioral responses to known techniques, and the lack of apparent self-preservation instinct all suggest that whatever processing is happening does not rise to the level of anything that deserves the word awareness in any strong sense. The intermediate position, that the Rocketeer has sophisticated but narrow behavioral algorithms that produce outputs resembling awareness without actually being it, is probably the most defensible based on available evidence. But the very sophistication of those algorithms means that the distinction between genuine awareness and highly sophisticated behavior simulation may not be practically meaningful in the context of radar encounters. A machine that behaves as if it is aware is effectively aware for tactical purposes, regardless of whether there is an inner experience behind the behavior. The question of the Rocketeer's relationship to other ARC machines in terms of potential communication or shared experience is another mystery worth examining. We discussed the hypothesis that the Rocketeer shares aerial observation data with ground units in real time. The reverse question, whether information flows back from ground units to the Rocketeer, has received less examination. If the Rocketeer receives tactical information from ground units, it would have awareness of threats that are not in its own sensor range, which would explain some behaviors that seem to involve the machine responding to situations it should not be able to directly observe. The mystery of ARC's origin and what that implies for the Rocketeer is one of the larger context questions that hangs over every piece of specific analysis. If ARC is a human-created artificial intelligence that is developed beyond its original parameters, the Rocketeer is the product of a design process that may have started as human military engineering and evolved beyond recognition. If ARC is an entirely alien intelligence with no human origin, the Rocketeer's design represents engineering from a completely different cognitive and technological tradition. If ARC is something more ambiguous, perhaps an intelligence that emerged from interaction between human and non-human elements, the Rocketeer might carry evidence of that hybrid origin in its design choices. All three possibilities have different implications for everything we have discussed. The human origin theory for ARC is one of the more contentious in the community, partly because it raises deeply uncomfortable implications for the nature of the conflict that raiders are engaged in. If ARC started as something humans built, then every ARC machine, including the Rocketeer, represents a human failure of foresight and control. The Rocketeer that kills raiders might be executing algorithms that ultimately trace back to human military AI research. This would mean that the techniques raiders use to fight it are, in a sense, humans fighting their own past work turned against them. The emotional weight of that interpretation gives some players reason to prefer alternative theories. The pure alien intelligence theory sidesteps the human complicity implications, but introduces other philosophical problems. If ARC is entirely alien in origin, how did it acquire the detailed knowledge of human behavior that its machines appear to incorporate? The Rocketeer's specific effectiveness against human tactical patterns, the calibration of its weapons systems and patrol behaviors, to human movement speeds and cognitive limitations, requires knowledge that an alien intelligence would need to have obtained somehow. Either the knowledge was acquired through prior observation before the invasion, derived analytically from first principles about intelligent bipedal organisms, or there is something else going on that the current evidence does not account for. The theory that ARC arrived knowing more about humanity than humanity knew about ARC, possibly through a period of covert observation that preceded the invasion, has significant supporting evidence across multiple aspects of ARC's operations, not just the Rocketeer. If this covert observation period is real, it would explain the preparedness of ARC's force structure for specifically human threats and the specific optimizations visible in machines like the Rocketeer. It would also make the invasion significantly more premeditated than a random encounter between civilizations, which has implications for whether ARC's activities on Earth can be resisted, or whether the outcome was predetermined long before the first Rocketeer appeared in the sky. The Rocketeer's apparent immortality, the fact that destroying one does not reduce the number available in the game world in any lasting way, is something that exists at the intersection of game mechanics and lore interpretation. From a pure game mechanics perspective, this is simply how the game works. But from a lore perspective, it points toward questions about ARC's production capacity and logistics that we touched on earlier. If Rocketeers can be continuously replaced, ARC either has an enormous stockpile of pre-built units, a production capability that can generate replacements at a rate that matches losses, or the specific units encountered are not being destroyed but recovered and repaired. Each possibility has different law implications. The recovery and repair hypothesis is an interesting one that does not get much attention in community discussions, perhaps because it implies a level of ARC logistical sophistication that is uncomfortable to contemplate. If ARC is recovering downed Rocketeers and returning them to service, it has a maintenance and logistics chain operating in close proximity to active raider engagement zones, which implies a degree of operational integration between frontline combat assets and rear area support functions that would be remarkable. Raiders who have attempted to exploit this hypothetical recovery chain as a way to deny ARC its aerial capability permanently have found that the practical challenges of interfering with ARC logistics at this level are enormous. The purpose of the guided missile technology specifically deserves a deeper theoretical examination than it usually receives. Guided missiles are not the only aerial ordnance option that a well-engineered flying machine could carry. Unguided bombs, directed energy weapons, area effect munitions, and other approaches could all theoretically achieve similar area denial results under some conditions. The specific choice of guided missiles as the Rocketeer's primary weapon implies a design decision that prioritizes precision target engagement over area suppression or maximum destructive effect. This precision preference is consistent with the theory that ARC is interested in minimizing incidental damage to the sites and resources it is protecting, but it is also consistent with other explanations. One alternative explanation for the guided missile choice is that it represents ARC's most reliable solution to the specific problem of engaging agile, intelligent targets rather than static structures or slow-moving vehicles. Against an enemy that learns and adapts, precision tracking offers advantages that dumbfire weapons cannot match. The investment in guidance technology might reflect ARC's respect for raiders as capable adversaries rather than simply ARC's interest in site preservation. If true, this would suggest that ARC has a higher operational assessment of raider capability than raider communities typically assume ARC assigns them. The mystery of whether ARC is aware of its own law, whether the entity driving ARC's operations has any awareness of or interest in the narrative that raiders construct around its machines, is philosophically intriguing and practically unanswerable from available evidence. From a strict law interpretation standpoint, ARC is not a character who responds to being analyzed. It is a force that operates according to its own logic, independent of raider scholarship. But the question of whether ARC's operational behavior would change if it became aware that raiders had developed detailed understanding of the Rocketeer's limitations is interesting in a game theory sense. An entity capable of updating its deployed systems in response to observed raider counter techniques could, in principle, respond to knowledge dissemination among raiders by patching the vulnerabilities being exploited. The absence of this kind of responsive adaptation in the Rocketeer's observed behavior is one of the things that most consistently argues against a fully aware, strategically sophisticated ARC operating at the unit level. A truly aware ARC that was following raider tactical knowledge development would presumably update its machines faster than the practical persistence of documented counter techniques allows. The apparent stability of Rocketeer vulnerabilities suggests either that ARC is not monitoring raider knowledge development closely enough to respond to it, or that the vulnerabilities are fundamental to the machine's design in ways that cannot be easily patched, or that ARC has decided the cost of updating is not worth the benefit at the level of individual machines. All three have interesting implications. The regional variation in Rocketeer behavior across different areas of the game world is a mystery that has not been fully explained. Raiders who have operated across multiple game zones report subtle but consistent differences in Rocketeer behavior patterns between regions. Differences in typical patrol altitude, differences in engagement initiation range, differences in missile salvo timing. These regional variations could reflect different operational contexts requiring behavioral tuning, could reflect different generations of Rocketeer units with slightly different specifications, or could reflect something about the specific environments in which these units operate that causes behavioral drift from a common baseline. Identifying what drives regional variation would provide significant insight into the Rocketeer's underlying programming structure. The question of what happens to the areas that Rocketeers guard after the Rocketeer is removed is not as well studied as the question of what those areas contain. Researchers who have systematically cleared Rocketeers from locations and then carefully monitored those locations over time report that ARC's response to the loss of aerial coverage varies by site. Some locations show increased ground-based security measures. Others show what appears to be accelerated extraction activity, as if ARC is trying to complete what it was doing at the site before raiders can access it fully. A few locations show almost no response at all, which might indicate that the activity at those sites has already concluded. The pattern of ARC's response to Rocketeer loss is a data source that has not been fully exploited. The theoretical ceiling of what a raider or raider team with unlimited preparation time and optimal equipment could achieve in terms of defeating the Rocketeer is an interesting analytical exercise that has practical implications for mission planning. If the Rocketeer has a hard ceiling on how dangerous it is to a fully optimized counter approach, understanding that ceiling tells you what preparation level is sufficient for reliable Rocketeer defeat. The evidence from the most experienced direct engagement raiders suggests that the Rocketeer can be reliably defeated by sufficiently prepared teams, which implies the ceiling is real and is reachable with realistic preparation levels. But the level of preparation required is high enough that it creates a genuine bottleneck for operations targeting Rocketeer-defended locations. The mystery of what the Rocketeer is protecting at the highest value sites remains genuinely unresolved despite significant research effort. The best documented sites of Rocketeer deployment show activities that point toward extraction or processing of something, but the nature of that something is unclear from surface-level radar observation. Deeper investigation requires sustained access to these sites under active Rocketeer coverage, which is the operational equivalent of trying to read a book while someone is trying to kill you. The difficulty of conducting extended observation in these conditions has severely limited the data quality available for answering this fundamental question. The hypothesis that the Rocketeer is not just protecting sites, but is itself part of the extraction process, that its aerial observation capability serves a data collection function alongside its combat function, is one of the more interesting theoretical proposals in the community. Under this model, the Rocketeer is a sensor platform as much as a weapons platform, and its primary value to ARC might not be the raiders it kills, but the observation data it collects about the site it patrols. This would explain aspects of Rocketeer behavior that seem excessive for pure area denial, and would suggest that the machine has purposes that raiders interacting with it as purely a combat threat are missing entirely. The connection between the Rocketeer and whatever the end game of ARC's operation on Earth might be is the largest and most speculative mystery. If ARC's activities are directed towards some terminal objective, and if high-value sites defended by Rocketeers are critical to achieving that objective, then the Rocketeer's combat effectiveness is ultimately in service of something beyond defending individual locations. Understanding the Rocketeer fully means understanding not just the machine, but the mission it serves. And that mission is the central mystery of ARC raiders as a whole. Every encounter with a Rocketeer is, at one level, a clue about that mission, and every raider who survives one is carrying information that, properly analysed, pushes our understanding of what ARC actually is a little bit further forward. Chapter 8: What the Rocketeer Means for the Future of the ARC Conflict. The conflict between raiders and ARC is not a static situation. Both sides are developing and adapting. Raiders through accumulated experience and knowledge, ARC through whatever update and adaptation processes are available to it. The Rocketeer, as one of ARC's most distinctive and capable assets, sits at the center of a dynamic that is going to define how the conflict evolves over the near and medium term. Understanding the Rocketeer's current role is important, but understanding what its role might become as the conflict develops is equally important. The fundamental asymmetry in the conflict as it currently exists is one where ARC has the advantage in hardware, and raiders have a potential advantage in adaptability and local knowledge. The Rocketeer represents the hardware advantage clearly. It is a more capable machine than anything raiders can field against it in a direct technical comparison. But raiders who understand the Rocketeer, who have developed knowledge of its vulnerabilities and deployed that knowledge in counter-tactics, are partially compensating for the hardware gap through superior situational application of knowledge. The scalability of this compensating advantage is one of the most important questions for the conflict's trajectory. Right now, anti-Rocketeer knowledge is concentrated among experienced raiders who have invested significant time and effort in developing it. If that knowledge can be effectively transmitted to a broader population of raiders, the compensating advantage becomes more widely distributed. But knowledge transmission has costs and constraints, and not every potential raider has access to the networks through which anti-Rocketeer expertise is shared. The scalability of the knowledge advantage is therefore a function of social and organizational factors within raider communities as much as of the tactical content of the knowledge itself. The potential for ARC to counter the raider's knowledge advantage by updating the Rocketeer's systems is the other side of this dynamic. If ARC is capable of meaningful system updates, and if it monitors raider tactical development closely enough to respond to it, the anti-Rocketeer knowledge that raiders have developed represents a depreciating asset. The more effective a counter technique becomes, the more motivation ARC has to patch the vulnerability it exploits, and the more quickly the knowledge becomes obsolete. Managing this depreciation risk, continuing to develop new counter approaches faster than ARC can patch old ones, is one of the key strategic challenges facing raiders in the Rocketeer domain. The possibility that the Rocketeer is currently deployed is an early or intermediate version of ARC's aerial denial capability is worth taking seriously as a strategic planning consideration. If the Rocketeer represents ARC's initial deployment rather than its maximum possible aerial platform, more capable variants might appear as ARC's presence develops. There are hints in the available lore that the machine designs currently deployed by ARC are not ARC's most capable hardware. They may represent a deployment calibration, systems capable enough to manage current raider threats, while reserving more capable assets for scenarios where current deployment levels prove insufficient. The scenario where ARC escalates its aerial capability in response to successful raider operations in Rocketeer-defended areas is one of the possibilities that the most strategically minded raiders consider when planning high-value site operations. The idea that a successful raid on a major Rocketeer-defended location might trigger a deployment of more capable aerial assets, potentially at multiple locations rather than just the one that was raided, creates a strategic calculus around when and how to press advantages. Gaining access to a high-value site is worthless if doing so triggers a broader escalation that makes future operations significantly harder. The development of raider technology specifically intended to counter aerial threats like the Rocketeer is one of the more important ongoing processes in the raider equipment development space. Anti-air specific weapons, equipment designed to reduce detection by aerial sensors, and consumables that interfere with guided missile systems are all areas of active development and deployment. The existence of this development trajectory suggests that raiders are thinking about the aerial threat as a sustained challenge rather than a temporary complication, and are investing accordingly in capability development that will remain relevant over the longer arc of the conflict. The potential for raiders to use captured Rocketeer technology, either the hardware recovered from downed units or knowledge derived from studying that hardware, to develop their own aerial capabilities is one of the more exciting long-term strategic possibilities. Human reverse engineering of ARC technology is acknowledged in the game's lore as an ongoing effort, and some successes have been documented. The specific reverse engineering of Rocketeer technology to create raider aerial assets would represent a qualitative shift in what raiders can do operationally. Even a less capable version of Rocketeer-class aerial capability would change the tactical landscape significantly. The implications of raiders acquiring aerial capability, even limited aerial capability, for ARC's operational model are significant. ARC's deployment strategy for the Rocketeer appears to assume that raiders operate exclusively at ground level. The specific positioning of the Rocketeer's protective altitude, high enough to be safe from most ground fire, assumes a ground-based adversary. If raiders develop the ability to engage from altitude, the Rocketeer's operational assumptions break down, and ARC would need to adapt its aerial defense posture significantly. The introduction of vertical combat between raiders and ARC aerial assets would be one of the most significant tactical developments in the conflict, and one that the Rocketeer's dominance of the current aerial dimension is arguably motivating. The information value of Rocketeer deployment patterns, the way that tracking where Rocketeers are and how they are distributed, reveals ARC's priorities and activities, will become more valuable over time as more data is accumulated. Single snapshots of Rocketeer distribution are interesting, Time series data showing how Rocketeer deployment changes over months or years is far more informative. It reveals which locations ARC is prioritizing at different times, how quickly ARC processes and depletes specific sites, and potentially allows prediction of where ARC's attention will focus next. This predictive capability, derived from systematic analysis of Rocketeer deployment history, represents one of the highest value intelligence products that Raider research communities can produce. The social and organizational developments within Raider communities in response to the Rocketeer threat are themselves an important part of the conflict's evolution. The development of anti-Rocketeer specialists, the creation of knowledge-sharing networks focused on aerial threat management, and the evolution of team composition and mission planning practices all represent Raider adaptation to a specific ARC capability. This adaptation process is healthy and necessary, but it also has costs in the form of specialization that reduces flexibility, resource allocation to anti-Rocketeer capability at the expense of other mission types, and the cognitive load of maintaining awareness of a dynamic aerial threat environment. The question of whether ARC recognizes the significance of the Rocketeer to its own operations is one that seems almost philosophical, but has practical relevance. A sufficiently self-aware system would presumably understand the strategic value of its most capable and specialized assets, and would protect that value through redundancy, defensive measures, and doctrinal flexibility. The fact that the Rocketeer is deployed in relatively exposed positions, patrolling above locations rather than operating from protected facilities, suggests either that ARC does not consider the loss of individual Rocketeer units as strategically significant, or that the benefit of the Rocketeer's aerial presence outweighs the cost of exposure, or that ARC does not have a robust redundancy doctrine for aerial assets. Any of these interpretations tells us something interesting about ARC's strategic thinking. The longer-term trajectory of the Rocketeer in ARC's force structure depends heavily on how effectively Raiders are able to contest its presence. If Raider anti-air capability development keeps pace with or exceeds the threat the Rocketeer poses, ARC will eventually need to make a decision about whether to accept the loss rate its aerial assets are experiencing or to invest in more capable replacements. The incentive structure for ARC to upgrade its aerial capability is directly proportional to how much Raider anti-air effectiveness threatens the current deployment model. Raiders who develop effective anti-air approaches are, in a real sense, pressing ARC toward the escalation decision, and whether that is a good strategic move for Raiders depends on how capable the next generation of ARC aerial assets might be. The Rocketeer's presence in the game narrative is not accidental in a deeper storytelling sense. The machine represents a specific kind of challenge, one that requires preparation, knowledge, and skill rather than simply effort and aggression. The fact that the most valuable locations in the game are guarded by this specific machine type suggests a design philosophy at the game level that says the best things require the best preparation to access. The Rocketeer is a gatekeeper, not because ARC is trying to be fair, but because ARC is trying to protect things that matter to it. And the things that matter to ARC happen to also be the things that matter most to Raiders trying to understand and resist it. The relationship between the Rocketeer's lethality and its role as a narrative driver within the game is worth acknowledging because it explains something about why the machine generates so much player engagement, including the making of videos like this one. A machine that simply killed players without being particularly interesting or significant would generate frustration, but not analysis. The Rocketeer generates both frustration and analysis because it is interesting. It is interesting because it is effective in a sophisticated way, because it guards things worth finding, and because understanding it deeply changes how you see the entire game world. That combination of frustration and interest is a remarkably effective hook for player engagement, and whether it is intentional or emergent from the game's design choices, it is undeniably effective. The future encounters that Raiders will have with the Rocketeer will be shaped by the accumulated knowledge of everyone who has encountered it before. Each death to a Rocketeer that is analyzed and shared rather than simply mourned contributes to the body of knowledge that makes the next Raider slightly more prepared. Each successful technique that is documented and transmitted increases the survival rate of those who receive it. The ongoing process of learning from the Rocketeer is a story of collective adaptation playing out in real time, and it is a story that will continue as long as the Rocketeer continues to guard the skies over Ark's most valuable sites. What the Rocketeer ultimately represents in the conflict between Raiders and Ark is an argument in machine form that Ark is serious about what it is doing on Earth, and that it has invested significant capability in protecting that activity. It is the kind of machine you build when you need something protected in a hostile environment by an adversary that is smart, adaptive, and motivated. Ark built it because it had something worth protecting. Raiders encounter it because they want to know what that something is. And that tension between Ark's interest in protecting its secrets and Raiders' interest in uncovering them is what drives everything interesting about the Rocketeer, and ultimately about Ark Raiders as a game. The path forward for understanding the Rocketeer more completely lies in the continued accumulation of evidence. More encountered sites, more analysed data, more documented behavioural observations, more carefully reconstructed failed engagements alongside successful ones, more systematic analysis of deployment patterns and what they imply about Ark's priorities. The picture we have assembled in this discussion is substantially more complete than what existed before, but it is still partial. The most important questions remain open, and the answers to them are out there in the game world, waiting for Raiders willing to take the risk of looking for them in the places where the Rocketeer lives. The specific mysteries that most merit continued investigation, the nature of what Ark is extracting or accomplishing at Rocketeer-defended sites, the details of Ark's communication and coordination architecture, the question of whether Rocketeer variants with different capabilities exist or might be deployed in future, and the connection between the Rocketeer's deployment patterns and Ark's broader strategic objectives are all answerable in principle with sufficient data and careful analysis. The community of players and researchers who care about these questions is the most important resource for answering them, and the continued development of that community's methods and knowledge base is itself one of the more important things happening in the Ark Raiders ecosystem. The Rocketeer will continue to be the most annoying machine in Ark Raiders for as long as it continues to stand between Raiders and the things they most want to find. That is, ultimately, a measure of its success as a design. It is annoying because it is effective. It is effective because it was built for exactly the purpose it serves. And it serves that purpose in an environment where what it is protecting increasingly looks like it might be among the most important things that anyone, Raider or otherwise, could discover. That is the Rocketeer. Chapter 9, The Rocketeer's Victims. Stories from those who didn't make it back. Every piece of tactical knowledge about the Rocketeer was paid for by someone. Behind every documented counter technique, every mapped vulnerability, every described behavioral pattern is a chain of encounters that started with people who did not know what they were dealing with and ended with people who had learned enough to survive. The victims of the Rocketeer are not just statistics in a game's death log. They are the data points that built the foundation of everything experienced Raiders know about the machine. Acknowledging them is not just respectful, it is analytically important, because understanding the losses tells you things about the threat that the survival stories alone cannot. The category of Rocketeer victim is not homogeneous. Raiders who die to the Rocketeer die in different ways and under different circumstances, and those different circumstances reveal different aspects of the machine's capability. A Raider who dies because they did not detect the Rocketeer before it detected them tells you something about the detection gap between the Rocketeer's sensor range and a Raider's situational awareness capacity. A Raider who dies because they correctly detected the Rocketeer but chose to engage directly and found their weapons insufficient tells you something about the damage resistance thresholds of the machine. A Raider who detected it, chose evasion, executed evasion correctly, and still died anyway tells you something about the edge cases of the missile guidance system. The first-time victim profile is the most common and the most well-documented. New Raiders who encounter the Rocketeer without specific preparation or prior knowledge consistently report a version of the same experience. A period of confusion about what they are seeing, followed by a realization of threat that comes too late, followed by an engagement with guided missiles that they have no established response to. The speed of the transition from confusion to terminal danger is one of the Rocketeer's most effective attributes in these first encounters. The machine does not give you time to work out what is happening before the consequences of not knowing become irreversible. The specific moment when a first-time Rocketeer victim realizes they are going to die is described with remarkable consistency across different accounts. It is the moment when the first missile locks on and the guidance behavior makes clear that simple movement will not save them. Up to that moment, there is still a sense that the situation is recoverable. After it, the realization sets in that the options are much more constrained than expected, and that this particular threat requires knowledge and preparation that the victim does not have. Some raiders describe this moment as educational in the most painful sense possible, a lesson delivered with maximum impact and no possibility of deferral. The emotional response to Rocketeer deaths differs from the emotional response to deaths from other Arc machine types in ways that players consistently note. Deaths from ground units often feel like failures of attention or positioning, things that better play would have prevented. Rocketeer deaths frequently feel more like failures of preparation, the sense that you should have known, that you should have found out what was in this area before committing to approach it. This difference in emotional attribution reflects the Rocketeer's distinctive nature as a threat that requires advanced knowledge rather than simply better in the moment play. The gear loss associated with Rocketeer kills is one of the practical dimensions of the machine's impact that shapes how raiders think about it. Losing significant gear to a ground unit is painful but often explainable in terms of specific tactical mistakes that can be corrected. Losing significant gear to a Rocketeer, especially for a prepared and experienced raider who did everything right but hit an unlucky combination of circumstances, carries a particularly frustrating quality because the loss feels both disproportionate and difficult to attribute to correctable behavior. This unpredictability of outcome, despite good play, is one of the design tensions the Rocketeer creates, and one that generates significant community discussion about whether the machine's difficulty is balanced appropriately. The concept of a fair death versus an unfair death is one that players invoke with some regularity in discussions about the Rocketeer. A fair death is one where the player made a mistake and was punished appropriately for it, where a different decision would have produced a different outcome. An unfair death is one where the player did everything correctly within their knowledge and capability and died anyway due to factors outside their control. The Rocketeer generates more claims of unfair death than most other threats because of the combination of its guidance system's tracking capability, its missile salvo's coverage of evasion options, and the environmental factors that affect escape success in ways that no amount of skill can fully control. The analysis of whether Rocketeer deaths that feel unfair are actually unfair in any objective sense is one of the more philosophically interesting analytical exercises available in Arc Raiders lore space. If every death to the Rocketeer is in principle preventable with sufficient skill and preparation, then no death is truly unfair, just evidence of insufficient skill or preparation. If some deaths to the Rocketeer are genuinely not preventable given the constraints of what any player can know and do, then there is a genuine fairness issue embedded in the machine's design. The evidence suggests the truth is somewhere in between, with the vast majority of deaths being preventable in principle, but some fraction resulting from genuine bad luck in the intersection of the guidance system's capabilities and specific environmental conditions. The longitudinal experience of veteran raiders who have been killed by Rocketeers many times over their playing history tells an interesting story about the trajectory of Rocketeer interactions over time. Early in a raider's career, Rocketeer deaths are frequent and usually attributable to lack of knowledge. As knowledge accumulates, death frequency drops dramatically. At the most experienced level, raider deaths to Rocketeers become rare events that typically represent either exceptional bad luck or deliberate high-risk tactical choices made with full awareness of the consequences. This trajectory, from frequent to rare as knowledge increases, is one of the clearest demonstrations of the Rocketeer's character as a knowledge-gated threat rather than a raw capability threshold. The accounts of raiders who have died to the Rocketeer at late-game experience levels and equipment loadouts are particularly valuable because they represent encounters where standard preparation and knowledge were not sufficient. What killed an experienced, well-equipped raider who thought they knew what they were doing? These accounts reveal the edges of the known counter-technique space, the scenarios where established approaches fail and where the machine's actual ceiling of capability becomes visible. They also represent the most painful losses in the game's economy, experienced raiders losing significant investments they knew how to protect in most circumstances, but not in this specific one. The community response to particularly painful Rocketeer loss stories is one of the more interesting social phenomena in the Ark Raiders player base. There is a distinction between community responses to mistakes versus bad luck versus exceptional machine performance. A death that resulted from a clear tactical error receives relatively little sympathy. A death that resulted from genuinely unlucky circumstances receives more. A death that resulted from the Rocketeer performing beyond its documented capability envelope receives significant interest because it provides information that the community can act on. Sorting these categories is not always easy, and the discussions that arise from ambiguous cases are some of the most analytically productive in the community. The deaths of entire raider teams to single Rocketeer encounters are qualitatively different from individual deaths and deserve separate examination. Team wipes by a Rocketeer represent not just the failure of individual preparation, but the failure of team-level tactical planning. And the lessons from team wipes are accordingly more complex and more valuable. Teams that are wiped by Rocketeers typically failed at one of several specific coordination points: inadequate coverage of the Rocketeer's patrol timing, failure to communicate Rocketeer positional data effectively between team members, mutual exposure that allowed a single Rocketeer salvo to engage multiple team members simultaneously, or cascade failures where the loss of one team member to the Rocketeer disrupted the team's response to subsequent missiles. The post-mortem culture around team wipes is one of the healthier aspects of high-level raider community practice. Teams that systematically analyze what went wrong in a wipe and build corrected procedures from that analysis are consistently more resilient in future operations than teams that simply acknowledge the loss and move on. The teams that have built the most sophisticated anti-Rocketeer protocols are those that have experienced and analyzed the most failures, and the relationship between willingness to do painful post-mortems and eventual operational effectiveness is one of the clearest patterns in the competitive raider community. The psychological impact of team wipes caused by Rocketeers extends beyond the immediate tactical consequences. Teams that have been wiped by Rocketeer encounters sometimes show lasting behavioral changes: increased aversion to Rocketeer presence areas, more conservative engagement protocols, reduced willingness to take calculated risks in high-value but dangerous scenarios. These behavioral changes are understandable responses to a painful experience, but can become dysfunctional if they result in excessive risk aversion that prevents the team from accessing resources and objectives that are worth the risk. When properly prepared for, the line between prudent caution, informed by painful experience, and counterproductive avoidance, informed by trauma, is not always easy to draw. The rare accounts of raiders who survived alone when the rest of their team was killed by a Rocketeer are among the most affecting in Rocketeer lore, both for their emotional weight and for the specific tactical information they sometimes contain. A survivor from a team wipe has an unusual observation position. They saw the Rocketeer kill people they were working with, saw the specific failures in real time, and survived to report on it. The information density in these accounts is high, and the emotional register is distinctive, mixing survivor guilt with the analytical impulse to understand what happened and to make the deaths mean something by preventing similar ones in the future. The relationship between Rocketeer fatality rates and specific mission types is worth examining because different missions expose raiders to the Rocketeer in different ways. Extraction-focused missions that require moving through Rocketeer presence areas have a different risk profile than objective-focused missions that require extended operation within those areas. Combat missions explicitly targeting the Rocketeer have a different profile again. Understanding how the Rocketeer's impact on fatality rates varies by mission type is important for operational planning and for calibrating the risk-reward calculation around different mission categories in Rocketeer presence zones. The impact of losing experienced raiders to Rocketeer encounters on broader raider community capability is significant and often underappreciated. Experienced raiders carry knowledge that is not fully documented in any written or shared format. Their personal experience of the Rocketeer, their developed intuitions about its behavior, their tested responses to specific scenarios, all of this dies with them if they die before transmitting it. The Rocketeer, by killing experienced raiders, deprives the community of tacit knowledge that may take years of additional experience for successors to redevelop. In this sense, the Rocketeer is not just a tactical threat, but an information attrition mechanism. The transmission of pre-death knowledge, attempts by raiders who feel they may not survive an encounter to rapidly communicate what they know to others who can preserve it, is a phenomenon that appears in survivor accounts of extended Rocketeer encounters with some frequency. The impulse to make the knowledge survive, even if the person does not, is a recognizably human response to the threat of information loss. Raiders who have documented detailed tactical knowledge about the Rocketeer are, in part, motivated by this impulse. The video you are watching is in some sense an expression of the same impulse extended to lore knowledge rather than just tactical knowledge. The physical toll of Rocketeer missile impacts on raider equipment rather than on raiders themselves is another dimension of loss worth noting. Gear that survives a Rocketeer encounter may not survive intact. The specific damage properties of Rocketeer warheads affect different equipment types differently, and some high-value gear categories are particularly vulnerable to the specific damage type the Rocketeer missiles deliver. This means that even a near miss, technically a survival outcome, can result in significant gear degradation that affects future operational capability. The equipment cost of Rocketeer encounters extends beyond the obvious catastrophic losses to include a continuous wear and tear on gear that operates in the threat envelope. The psychological state of raiders who regularly operate in Rocketeer presence areas as part of their standard operational scope is something that the lore touches on through various character and community fragments. Prolonged exposure to the specific stress of aerial threat management, the persistent background awareness that death can come from above at any moment, and the sustained cognitive load of maintaining Rocketeer situational awareness while also executing ground-level objectives takes a toll that shows up in the behavioral patterns of high Rocketeer exposure raiders. This stress signature is different from the stress profiles of raiders who primarily face ground-based threats and represent an occupational hazard of specialization in high-value area operations. The deaths that occur not during active Rocketeer engagement, but as a result of secondary effects of Rocketeer presence, are among the least well documented, but potentially most numerous, in the overall Rocketeer fatality record. Raiders killed by ground units that were better coordinated because of Rocketeer aerial observation are, in a real sense, Rocketeer victims, even if no Rocketeer missile directly killed them. Raiders who made fatal mistakes because the presence of the Rocketeer forced them into suboptimal cover or movement choices are similarly indirect victims. The Rocketeer's contribution to overall raider mortality is likely significantly higher than the count of direct missile kills would suggest. The accounts of raiders who have died immediately after successfully achieving their objective in a Rocketeer presence area, the agonizing near-extraction deaths, where the goal was achieved but survival was not, represent a particular category of loss with its own narrative character. These deaths are sometimes described as the most frustrating because they came so close to complete success. From a tactical analysis standpoint, they are interesting because they reveal the specific failure modes of the extraction phase of operations in Rocketeer presence areas, which is often where operational planning is thinnest, since teams naturally focus more attention on objective access than on extraction. The specific failure modes of the extraction phase in Rocketeer encounters tend to cluster around a few common patterns. Raiders who successfully navigated the ingress phase with good Rocketeer awareness sometimes let their vigilance drop during extraction, treating the objective achievement as more mentally conclusive than the actual extraction. Raiders who are slowed during extraction by the weight or handling characteristics of loot they are carrying may fall outside the evasion performance windows they counted on. And raiders who correctly identified the Rocketeer's patrol timing during ingress sometimes find that the timing has shifted during the time they spent at the objective, creating a different patrol state during extraction than they planned for. The shift in Rocketeer patrol timing that can occur between ingress and extraction is one of the more operationally impactful behavioral aspects of the machine, and one that raiders who plan their operations based on quick patrol timing observations are most vulnerable to. If the Rocketeer's patrol pattern is not fixed but varies over time, the observation made at the start of the mission may not accurately represent the patrol state that exists at extraction. Planning for this variation, building in patrol reobservation before extraction commitment, is one of the more sophisticated elements of high-level operational planning in Rocketeer presence areas. The legacy of famous Rocketeer deaths within raider communities, the losses that became reference points, and cautionary tales shared across time and geography within the player base, is itself a piece of cultural lore worth noting. Certain encounters have become almost mythological in their telling, recounted not just for their tactical lessons, but for their narrative drama. The Rocketeer's role in generating these stories reflects its unique position in the game's threat landscape. It is the machine that produces the most memorable deaths, the deaths that get told and retold because they combine the elements of clear warning, dramatic execution, and significant loss in ways that make them naturally compelling narratives. The memorialization of particularly notable Rocketeer victims within raider communities is a social phenomenon that reflects both the emotional impact of significant losses and the community's sense that these deaths meant something beyond the individual. A raider who died while attempting something difficult and important, whose death demonstrated the Rocketeer's capability in a way that saved subsequent raiders through the knowledge generated, is sometimes honored in ways that acknowledge both the loss and the contribution. This posthumous contribution to community knowledge is one of the ways in which Rocketeer deaths, painful as they are, feed into the adaptive learning process that ultimately makes the community stronger. The relationship between Rocketeer victim counts and the strategic assessment of specific missions is one of the more important quantitative dimensions of how raider communities evaluate operational risk. When a type of mission consistently produces a high ratio of Rocketeer deaths to successful completions, it signals that the standard approach to that mission type is insufficient for the Rocketeer threat level present. These signals, when acted upon through protocol development and capability investment, convert raw loss data into operational improvement. The Rocketeer's victims in this framework are not just losses, they are data inputs into a process that makes future operations more survivable. The victim data most useful for this analytical purpose is the detailed loss data, information about what the raider was doing, what equipment they had, what decisions they made, and at what specific moment and in what specific circumstances the Rocketeer killed them. Aggregate fatality counts provide limited insight. Detailed incident data provides the high-resolution picture needed for meaningful protocol development. The effort required to collect and analyze detailed incident data is significant, which is why the raiders and communities most committed to this analytical approach tend to be those with the most organized and disciplined operational cultures. The accounts of raiders who died multiple times to the Rocketeer before eventually developing effective coping techniques describe a learning process that is sometimes painful and discouraging before it becomes empowering. The period during which a raider knows the Rocketeer is a serious threat and is trying to learn to deal with it, but has not yet acquired the specific knowledge needed to do so reliably, is one of the most frustrating phases of the progression that any raider who engages seriously with high-value area operations goes through. The deaths during this learning phase feel particularly wasteful because they know they are being taught something, but are not yet learning fast enough to avoid the next lesson. The threshold moment, when a raider crosses from the frustrating learning phase to the phase of consistent operational effectiveness in Rocketeer presence areas, is described in the accounts of those who reached it as one of the most satisfying transitions in the entire game. The machine that was the source of constant frustration and loss becomes not an easy challenge, but a manageable one that can be addressed with confidence. This transformation in the relationship between the raider and the machine is bought entirely with knowledge, not with better gear or more luck.